They danced under chandeliers while quietly fighting a battle no one dared mention. Beneath the silk and steel, every woman carried a secret struggle hidden behind elegance and dim candlelight. What looked graceful was often held together by pain, timing, and fear of a single misstep. Each detail you thought you understood is about to shift into something far stranger than rumor ever suggested. Tonight, you will walk beside them and feel the weight of what history never said aloud. So before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone were to witness a Victorian ballroom for the first time, they might think the night was built entirely on elegance and effortless charm. The room was always bright, lit by chandeliers that seemed determined to outshine the hours passing by. Beneath them, polished floors reflected the shapes of guests, moving in steady patterns, each step rehearsed over years of expectation. Dancing was not simply a pastime, it was an essential part of belonging to the social world that determined reputations, marriages, and standing. Those who entered the ballroom understood that they were stepping into a long, unbroken ritual, one that demanded attention, restraint, and a kind of endurance disguised as grace. Women carried the heaviest burden of these gatherings. Their appearance was scrutinized more closely than their partner's steps, and their behavior had to remain polished regardless of how long the night continued. Preparation began hours before the first note was played. Dresses were layered onto their bodies until movement felt calculated. Corsets were tightened until breaths came with control rather than ease. Hair was arranged into shapes that allowed no disorder. By the time they finally reached the ballroom, they were already tired, yet the night had only begun. The structure of Victorian nights was unforgiving. Events often started late, long after the city's ordinary workers had fallen asleep. But for the upper classes, these late hours were normal. They filled them with social obligations, music, and strict protocols disguised as entertainment. Leaving early was rarely acceptable. Even standing still for too long invited questions. Women were expected to participate, to move continuously through dances, conversations, and polite displays of interest. The night stretched long past the moment when their feet began to ache, yet none of that discomfort was meant to show on their faces. Inside the ballroom, the heat grew quickly. Dozens of bodies, layers of fabric, the weight of candles burning overhead, all of it wrapped the dancers in a warm haze. Women felt the heat most sharply because their dresses trapped every bit of warmth against their skin. Sweat formed, but could not be acknowledged. Fatigue gathered, but could not be shown. The social rules of the time allowed no visible crack in composure. Any sign of discomfort could be misread, turned into gossip, or seen as a failure to maintain the image expected of a respectable woman. Even the act of dancing required more strength than most admitted. Partners might rotate, but the music rarely slowed. The pace of waltzes, reels, and quadrilles demanded constant attention. A single misstep could lead to embarrassment, and embarrassment carried a weight that often lasted longer than the evening itself. Younger women, eager to be seen and remembered, pushed themselves through every dance, even when their bodies protested. Older women familiar with the strain chose their moments more carefully, though they too were bound by the expectation to appear composed. All of this created a quiet tension behind every gesture. The women who glided so smoothly across the floor had learned to suppress discomfort, to ignore the tightness of their corsets, the pressure on their lungs, and the fatigue in their legs. The ballroom rewarded silence. It rewarded self-control. It rewarded anyone who could pretend that human needs did not exist. In that environment, even small physical impulses became something to avoid, something that had to disappear beneath layers of etiquette. The longer the night continued, the more demanding it became. Tea and champagne were offered freely, and although they seemed harmless, they contributed to a challenge no one spoke about directly. Women understood that they had to be careful with what they drank. Too much could disrupt the delicate balance of maintaining grace while fighting the body's natural responses. But refusing refreshments also risked appearing impolite. It was another quiet battle that played out within the seemingly smooth rhythm of the evening. Social expectations shaped every movement. Conversation had to remain polite. Smiles had to be controlled. Posture had to be perfect. Even exhaustion near dawn, when the body finally admitted its limits, had to be hidden behind the same calm expression maintained since the first dance. Victorian society insisted that respectability required sacrifice, and nowhere was this more visible than inside a ballroom lit against the night. Leaving the event did not end the performance. Women stepped into carriages with the same controlled posture, still watched, still expected to appear unaffected by hours of pressure. Only once they reached their homes could they remove the layers that had pressed against their bodies all night. Only then could they acknowledge that what looked effortless in the ballroom was anything but. These gatherings were designed to appear refined, yet every detail relied on women enduring discomfort in silence. Beneath the glitter of chandeliers and the polite conversations, the truth was that the ballroom demanded far more than beauty. It demanded obedience to social expectations that cared little for the limits of the human body. And the women who participated in these nights knew that the strictest test of composure was not the dancing, it was the need to hide every trace of strain. These long hours of controlled elegance revealed only a fraction of what women endured inside those crowded rooms. There were still other burdens woven into their movements that rarely reached the surface. And as the night deepened behind the glow of chandeliers, one detail about their silent struggle became harder to ignore than all the rest. The fullness of a Victorian gown was often praised as a symbol of refinement, yet the sheer volume of fabric made even the simplest movement feel calculated. Crinolines and bustles occupied space far beyond the body they surrounded, forming rigid shapes that followed women through every doorway and corridor. The gowns appeared light from a distance, floating as the wearer walked, but the structure beneath told another story. Layers of cloth, concealed metal hoops, padded supports, and intertwined bands designed to hold the skirt in its exaggerated form. What looked graceful on the surface was in reality a carefully managed cage. Living inside this construction required practice. The inner layers often clung to the skin, warmed by hours of dancing or sitting under candlelight. Above them, the outer fabric added weight that pulled at the hips and waist. Even a short walk required awareness of where the skirt extended. Turning too quickly could cause the hoop to swing wide. Passing through a narrow space meant slowing down, adjusting posture, and hoping the edges of the crinoline did not catch on furniture. Every movement became a negotiation between the woman and the engineering that surrounded her. The structure of the gown was complex enough in ordinary moments, but in private situations, when the body's natural needs could no longer be ignored, it became something else entirely. The combination of layers, hoops, and tight lacing transformed a basic human action into a logistical challenge. Women understood this before even stepping into a ballroom. They prepared mentally for the strain, knowing that once dressed, they were committing to hours of limited mobility. That limitation followed them into every corner of the evening, especially when the question of relief arose. Inside the gowns, the weight of the fabric rested heavily on the hips and lower back. The pressure of the corset above and the structure of the skirt below created a fixed posture that could not be broken easily. Sitting required precise control, so the hoops did not tilt in awkward directions. Bending was nearly impossible. Even lifting the skirt demanded assistance. Without help, the layers folded back onto themselves, trapping the woman in a maze of fabric that felt unyielding. It was clear that the design of the dress had never considered practicality. It was built to be seen, not to be lived in. The problem intensified in the context of long social events. Hours of movement, heat, and refreshments created needs that could not be postponed indefinitely. Yet the gown resisted every attempt to address them discreetly. The hoops pressed outward, the fabric layers tangled with one another, and the stays of the corset limited any attempt at maneuvering. Managing these dresses alone required strength and flexibility that the garments themselves restricted. Even reaching for the underlayers demanded more space than most private rooms allowed. Because of this, women relied heavily on their maids. These helpers understood the structure of the gown intimately. They knew how to lift the outer layer without causing the entire skirt to collapse inward, how to hold the metal frame steady, and how to navigate the fragile balance between speed and silence. In the best circumstances, the process was merely awkward. In crowded houses or unfamiliar settings, it became almost impossible. The crinoline created a barrier that had to be dismantled just to allow basic bodily function, yet the entire situation had to remain unseen, unspoken, and unnoticed. The fabric itself added another layer of difficulty. Silk taffeta and layered cotton absorbed moisture easily. Any miscalculation risked visible stains which carried a level of humiliation far greater than the physical discomfort. The weight of social expectation pressed as heavily as the metal hoops. Cleanliness was a performance, and even a small failure in discretion could leave a lasting mark on one's reputation. The fear of such failure shaped every decision women made during these nights. Spatial limitations also contributed to the challenge. Retiring rooms were often cramped, designed for resting rather than complex maneuvering, with a skirt that extended several feet in circumference. A woman entering such a space with a full crinoline created an instant obstacle. The gown-filled corners brushed against walls and left little room for movement. Even with the help of a maid, the simple act of positioning oneself required patience and caution. There was no angle from which the gown did not intrude. The bustle which followed the crinoline in later decades solved some problems, but created others. It removed the hoop, but added rigid padding at the back that extended outward in unnatural shapes. Sitting required careful adjustment, and leaning forward became a delicate task. Using any kind of private facility meant navigating a piece of clothing that insisted on drawing attention to itself, even when the wearer wanted nothing more than to be unseen. The bustle shifted with every step, reminding the woman of what she carried. Despite all this, the gowns remained popular. They symbolized status, femininity, and adherence to fashion. The discomfort they caused was considered a small price for the admiration they brought. Women were expected to endure to maintain elegance without exposing the effort required to sustain it. In public, the dresses displayed wealth. In private, they created difficulties no one acknowledged openly. The tension between beauty and practicality was accepted as part of life, even when it bordered on the absurd. What made the situation even more difficult was the silence surrounding it. Women rarely spoke about the challenges imposed by these garments. To complain was to admit weakness, or to challenge the norms that dictated their role in society. Instead, they endured quietly, managing the physical strain in ways that blended seamlessly into the rituals of the evening. The crinoline and bustle became symbols of gendered expectation, shaping not only how women appeared, but how they moved, behaved, and accommodated the demands placed upon their bodies. These cumbersome gowns revealed how much effort lay beneath the image of effortless grace presented to the world. There remained aspects of this struggle that were rarely mentioned even among women themselves, and once the truth behind these elaborate garments is seen clearly, another layer of difficulty emerges that reshapes how the entire night is understood. The elegance of Victorian fashion was designed to be admired from a distance, as though beauty could erase the physical realities hidden beneath the layers. No one attending a grand ball wanted to imagine that the women drifting across the floor were struggling with ordinary human needs. The very structure of the era's clothing relied on silence. It demanded that the body be disguised, compressed, and reshaped until it no longer resembled something living. Fashion praised refinement, yet it forced women into conditions that made even the simplest biological functions feel unspeakable. Beneath the lace colors and glittering jewels lay a tension that society refused to acknowledge. This refusal was not accidental. The culture of the time depended on the illusion that women floated through their responsibilities without strain. Their gowns hid their legs, the corsets hid their breathing, and the silence hid their needs. By layering fabric and expectation together, Victorian society insisted that the female body remain invisible. Anything that broke that illusion, including the necessity of relief, was treated as an intrusion into a world built on manners and restraint. Women learned quickly that acknowledgement of these matters could stain a reputation just as deeply as any social misstep. Inside the ballrooms, the challenge grew sharper. The generous flow of tea, champagne, and refreshments appeared harmless, offered with the same courtesy that structured every part of the evening. But for the women who had already endured hours of tight lacing and restricted movement, each drink added another quiet burden. They were expected to accept politely, to sip without complaint, and to continue dancing, as if the body beneath the silk responded obediently to every social expectation. And when the body did not, the problem had to be solved in silence. The act of addressing such a need, however, was far from simple. The shape of the gown created barriers that seemed almost intentionally designed to prevent access. Hoops expanded outward, bustles lifted fabric to unnatural heights, and several layers of petticoats clung together in the warm air. Women were effectively trapped inside their own clothing. It was not a matter of personal weakness, it was an engineered limitation woven into the ritual of dressing. Navigating this structure required help, yet the need for help could never be spoken openly. Instead, everything happened behind closed doors and in hurried whispers. Maids became experts in performing awkward tasks with speed and precision, lifting layers of fabric while keeping the outer appearance untouched. They learned how to hold the metal frame steady, how to fold the fabric without allowing it to collapse, and how to position themselves so that no sound carried beyond the walls. It was a choreography known only to the women, and their attendants performed in cramped spaces lit by dim candles. What appeared graceful in the ballroom often became chaotic in private. The emotional weight of this secrecy was heavy. Women knew their bodies were expected to behave as though they were not bodies at all. Every human function was treated as though it violated the rules of elegance. The more natural the impulse, the more urgently it had to be hidden. And because society insisted that such needs were impolite to acknowledge, women internalized the discomfort and shame attached to them. They became experts at silence long before they learned the steps of a waltz. This silence extended into the design of the garments themselves. The fabrics chosen for evening wear were delicate but opaque, meant to suggest purity while concealing everything beneath. Lace trimmed the sleeves, beads lined the bodice, and ribbons tied at the waist drew the eye upward away from the areas responsible for the difficulties no one wanted to mention. The clothing celebrated the idea of femininity, while making real womanhood nearly impossible to manage. Even the smallest mistake could threaten the illusion that held Victorian social life together. These realities did not simply cause discomfort, they shaped behavior. Women calculated how much they could drink, how long they could dance, and how far they could move from any room that offered a bit of privacy. Some developed a near-constant awareness of their own body's limits, not out of personal preference, but because fashion and expectation demanded it. The ballroom may have looked like a place of beauty, but beneath the layers of lace and candlelight, there was always a quiet battle between dignity and biology. The paradox was impossible to ignore. Victorian society celebrated modesty, but forced women into circumstances that made modesty nearly unattainable. The clothing demanded control, while stripping away the ability to manage basic needs independently. The expectations praised fragility but punished any sign of real vulnerability. Women became symbols of grace only by hiding the most unavoidable parts of themselves. And the more tightly society clung to the illusion of elegance, the more desperate these hidden moments became. Over time, this quiet struggle became woven into the rhythm of social life. It was not discussed, not recorded in polite letters, and rarely acknowledged even between women. But it shaped every moment of the evening. It determined how long someone remained on the dance floor, how often they disappeared into hallways, and how carefully they monitored their own discomfort. The illusion demanded constant attention, and beneath it the truth of their experience persisted, unseen yet impossible to escape. These concealed routines revealed the distance between what Victorian society wished to display and what women were forced to endure. There were still other complications embedded in this silence that shaped the way they moved through the night. A closer look at those hidden moments uncovers a difficulty far more troubling than the elegance seen from the ballroom floor. Many Victorian estates praised for their elegance concealed an uncomfortable truth. Essential sanitation had not yet reached the standards people imagine today. Indoor plumbing was inconsistent across the century, and flushing toilets remained rare luxuries, found only in the most progressive households. Grand homes used for balls relied instead on aging setups, closets converted for waste, small chambers equipped with simple vessels, or improvised arrangements tucked far from the areas occupied by guests. Those attending the event quickly discovered that refinement ended the moment one stepped away from the ballroom's glow. Private rooms intended for such purposes were almost always positioned at a distance. They lingered at the ends of long corridors, down steep back staircases, or along servant passages dimly lit and often overlooked. Reaching them demanded navigating architecture that favored spectacle over practicality. Even a confident guest could lose her bearings in these narrow spaces, and a woman wearing a crinoline had to move carefully to avoid catching the frame on corners furniture or passing attendants. Every step became a negotiation with the gown's size and the building's outdated design. Most of these rooms offered little comfort. A faint smell lingered from earlier visitors, and the air often felt stale. The walls absorbed moisture, and the low ceilings trapped heat from flickering candles. Ventilation was minimal, and maintenance during large events was irregular at best. Servants cleared vessels when they could, replaced candles when they dimmed, and attempted to keep pathways accessible, but their responsibilities elsewhere always took priority. Guests, entering these rooms, met spaces that were functional only in the loosest sense. Dim, cramped, and lacking the sanitation one might expect in houses of such wealth. Light itself posed a problem. Candles flickered with every draught, threatening to plunge parts of the hallway into sudden darkness. Shadows stretched awkwardly across floors and walls, complicating movement even further. Some estates had uneven steps or slanted boards hidden beneath rugs. A woman navigating these hazards in a large gown risked stumbling or losing balance, yet she could not appear rushed or anxious. Maintaining composure was part of the unspoken code of the evening, no matter how impractical the surroundings. Silence accompanied every attempt to reach these rooms. Hosts often preferred not to acknowledge their inadequacy, as admitting such flaws broke the illusion of refinement they tried hard to present. Guests, especially women, hesitated to show any sign of need that might draw attention. Victorian social norms demanded restraint, and nothing was considered less appropriate for polite discussion than bodily needs. This culture of avoidance meant that the condition of these facilities remained largely ignored, even when their shortcomings inconvenienced nearly every woman at the event. Fear of judgment added another invisible burden. Women understood that being seen walking toward these distant rooms could spark whispered conversations. Even innocent intentions risked being interpreted in ways that harmed one's reputation. Discretion became essential. Many women timed their exits carefully, slipping away between dances or mingling with others long enough to justify their absence. Some pretended to adjust their gown or seek fresh air, masking their true purpose behind gestures considered socially acceptable. Even once inside, challenges persisted. The size of a crinoline conflicted with the small dimensions of the rooms, leaving little space for maneuvering. The doors barely opened wide enough. Corners, crowded with basins or stored linens, made the room feel even tighter. The metal frame beneath the skirt resisted folding, and the petticoats clung together in the warmth, forming barriers that had to be lifted and held in awkward positions. A maid's assistance was essential, yet the process had to remain silent and quick. Women learned to coordinate these moments with their attendants, relying on practiced techniques that preserved dignity while revealing the absurdity of their situation. Architecture contributed to the problem. Many estates were built decades before indoor facilities were considered, and renovations rarely included rethinking the placement of private rooms. Instead, households adapted old spaces, often without considering the demands of large gatherings. Guests were left to manage their needs with whatever limited accommodations existed. The result was a system that functioned poorly, but persisted because no one openly challenged its inadequacy. Despite these obstacles, appearances in the ballroom continued uninterrupted. Candlelight glowed against polished floors, music guided dancers in elegant patterns, and guests admired the grandeur without considering the hidden struggles taking place in dim back rooms. The difference between public grace and private inconvenience grew wider with each passing hour. Women carried this contrast, silently balancing the expectations of the evening against the realities imposed by the environment. These journeys through dark hallways and cramped rooms became a quiet part of every ball. They shaped how women moved, how much they drank, and how often they slipped away from the dancing. Even though no one discussed it openly, the difficulty of addressing necessities influenced the entire rhythm of the night. It was an unseen tension built into the structure of Victorian social life, one that rarely appeared in the polished descriptions of grand events. These hidden spaces revealed how deeply Victorian society valued appearances over practicality. Other obstacles tied to these expectations continued to shape women's actions throughout the night. A closer look at their silent adjustments exposes the next layer of what these evenings demanded. Rooms tucked behind the bright halls of Victorian estates often hid objects that revealed far more about daily life than the polished surfaces shown to guests. Among these quiet fixtures was the slop jar placed discreetly in dressing rooms, retiring rooms, and small private chambers, where women stepped away from the crowd for only a moment. It stood in plain sight, yet went unacknowledged, wrapped in the silent agreement that necessity should never disturb the illusion of refinement. Nothing about it was glamorous, but everything about it was essential. A slop jar usually carried a simple, sturdy design. Ceramic vessels with smooth white glaze or tin containers with muted metal sheen offered durability rather than beauty. A fitted lid sealed the top, hiding both sight and odor. Household staff often tried to blend the jar into the decor by placing it near draped fabric behind a folding screen or beside a vanity stool, where it could be mistaken for a mundane container. Glances rarely revealed its purpose, which was precisely the point. It was an object meant to be present, but unseen, used often, yet never spoken of. Dressing rooms provided the most plausible setting for these jars. Women retreated there, under the pretense of adjusting their gowns, tightening laces, or retrieving a forgotten item. Servants hovered nearby, attentive, yet silent, ready to lift fabric or fetch water. Hidden in these pauses was the true function of the slop jar. Reaching the distant privies scattered across large estates was impractical, especially during crowded events. The jar offered a compromise, a way to maintain composure without crossing half the house in restrictive clothing. Using it required a practiced sequence of movements. A woman lifted her heavy skirts, while her maid steadied the layers of fabric and metal. The crinoline cage demanded careful handling to prevent it from scraping chairs or knocking screens aside. Privacy depended not on locks or solid walls, but on coordination, timing, and the hope that no one approached the door. The lid opened quietly, the jar served its purpose, and then the moment vanished into silence. Everything had to remain discreet, as though it had never happened. Social rules allowed the jar to exist only as long as it was never acknowledged. The object represented a boundary. Victorian society refused to cross the admission that even well-dressed women had bodily needs. Hosts rarely mentioned the jars. Guests pretended they did not notice them, and servants avoided speaking of them even among themselves. The jar became a symbol of a broader cultural expectation that real human needs should never interfere with the fragile spectacle of elegance. Its size and design varied from home to home. Smaller jars sat in private rooms used by families, while large estates equipped retiring rooms with multiple vessels to accommodate the constant flow of guests during lengthy gatherings. Some places positioned several jars behind screens, so women could enter and leave unnoticed. But even with these precautions, embarrassment always lingered as a possibility. A poorly timed exit might lead to an unexpected encounter in the corridor. Women learned to move softly and choose their moments carefully. The lighting in these rooms offered little comfort. A single candle or wall-mounted lamp cast long shadows against draped fabric and polished wood. Darkness shielded women from view, yet created an eerie atmosphere. The glint of ceramic under unsteady light served as a quiet reminder that the world behind these doors was far removed from the ballroom's brilliance. Here, the polished floors and chandeliers felt like distant illusions, replaced by flickering shadows and the subtle sound of skirts brushing against screens. Servants bore the responsibility of maintaining these jars throughout the night. They emptied them discreetly into larger waste containers, cleaned them, and replaced them, without letting their presence disrupt the event. Their work required precision and invisibility. A servant caught in the wrong hallway with a jar in hand risked drawing unwanted attention, yet the task continued because no ball could function without it. Their unspoken labor sustained the illusion guests relied upon. The jar also reflected the limitations imposed by women's clothing. Corsets restricted movement, layers of petticoats held heat, and the structural frames beneath gowns made long distances uncomfortable. Every element of fashion pushed women toward these jars, offering relief that did not demand a journey across unfamiliar hallways. Yet, depending on the jar, it added another layer of pressure, the need to remain composed while navigating a situation designed to be both necessary and hidden. What the slop jar revealed more than anything was the contradiction embedded in Victorian social life. Events celebrated beauty, discipline, and refinement, while simultaneously forcing women into cramped corners with objects that contradicted every aesthetic ideal. The jar did not belong to the world of chandeliers or polished floors, yet it was indispensable to the people who moved through those glamorous rooms. The elegance above and the necessity below coexisted, each shaping the experience of the other. Women returned to the dance floor afterward, faces calm postures, steady, their private moments concealed beneath layers of silk and expectation. No one questioned how they endured long nights without modern conveniences. No one acknowledged the jars waiting quietly behind screens. The silence preserved the illusion, but the truth remained in the shadows of those small rooms. This concealed vessel exposed the fragile balance between grace and struggle that defined the evening. Other forms of assistance shaped this balance, just as deeply influencing how women managed every demanding moment behind the glow of the ballroom. Hidden support waits just beyond the next doorway. No woman attending a Victorian ball moved through the night entirely on her own. Beneath the layers of silk, taffeta, and metal frames was a quiet dependence that shaped every private moment behind the ballroom's glow. Ladies appeared self-possessed on the dance floor, but the truth behind closed doors told a different story. They needed help, and that help came from the hands of their maids. Without these attendants, navigating even the simplest physical task would have bordered on impossible. A maid understood her role long before the evening began. She memorized the structure of her mistress's gown, the arrangement of petticoats, the shape of the crinoline, and the quirks of each fastening or clasp. Her job was not merely to assist, but to anticipate. When her mistress stepped toward a retiring room, the maid fell into place instinctively, ready to lift, steady, or shield as needed. The work demanded skill, discretion, and a trained sensitivity to the unspoken tension that accompanied every movement. Once inside, the dim rooms tucked away from the music, the maid became indispensable. Heavy skirts needed lifting, and no lady could manage them alone. The crinoline frame resisted folding and swung outward at every angle, threatening to strike furniture or expose more than intended. The maid held the structure firmly, keeping it stable while gathering fabric into temporary folds. Her hands worked quickly, forming a protective space in which her mistress could move with minimal risk of staining or tearing her clothing. Speed was everything. Time spent away from the ballroom attracted attention. The longer a woman stayed in a private room, the more likely someone might notice her absence. A maid learned to work in silence, moving with the efficiency of someone performing a task dozens of times, yet never allowed to acknowledge it aloud. She bent, lifted, steadied, and repositioned without a word, blending into the shadows as part of the room's machinery. Silence, however, did not diminish the pressure. A single misstep, a dropped fabric layer, a sudden shift in the metal cage, a faint scrape against the floor, could turn a delicate moment into a humiliating one. The maid bore the responsibility of preventing such accidents. Her touch had to be firm enough to control the gown, but gentle enough not to wrinkle or crease it. Her movements had to be precise, as even the smallest error risked compromising the lady's carefully curated appearance. There was no praise for this work. It existed outside the realm of society's admiration. Guests spoke of dresses, jewelry, and dance partners, but never of the hands that kept everything intact. A maid's presence was expected but never acknowledged. Her contribution was essential yet invisible. This invisibility became part of the structure of the evening, a system in which women appeared graceful only because someone else labored to make that grace possible. The maids themselves understood the delicate boundaries of their role. They stayed close enough to be summoned with a glance, but far enough to maintain the illusion of independence. They moved through corridors unnoticed, blending with servants carrying trays, lanterns, or linens. Their footsteps echoed softly alongside the quiet urgency of their duties. They were witnesses to every private struggle, yet remained silent keepers of those moments. Inside the retiring rooms, their work became even more demanding. Screens cast long shadows, and the soft glow of candlelight made visibility uneven. Under such lighting, the maid had to interpret every gesture from her mistress, a lifted eyebrow, a slight nod, a change in breath. Communication relied on instinct more than speech. The maid responded to each cue, adjusting fabric, steadying the metal frame, or shielding her mistress from the doorway until everything was complete. Even the way maids handled the garments reflected a kind of intimate training. They knew which layers were the heaviest, which sections of fabric snagged easily, and how to fold the skirts temporarily without creasing them. They maneuvered the rigid structure beneath the dress, so it wouldn't scrape the floor or reveal too much leg. They made the impossible seem manageable, turning what could have been a chaotic flurry of fabric into a controlled, silent ritual. The emotional side of their work was equally significant. Ladies placed enormous trust in their maids, relying on them during moments that Victorian society preferred to ignore. A maid protected not only clothing, but also dignity. When she positioned herself between her mistress and the door, she guarded more than privacy. She safeguarded reputation. Any hint of impropriety could fuel gossip, and gossip travelled quickly through drawing rooms and garden paths alike. In these quiet rooms, the maid became the last shield against social consequences. Outside, the ballroom continued without interruption. Music swelled, dresses glimmered in candlelight, and couples spun across polished floors as though the night demanded nothing except beauty. Yet behind the scenes, maids hurried between rooms, adjusting lifting and holding together the hidden mechanisms that allowed these performances to continue. Their labor stitched together the silence between dances, making the illusion of effortlessness possible. What made their work even more striking was the contrast between their importance and their invisibility. They shaped the experience of every woman they served, yet their faces were forgotten as soon as the music resumed. They were part of the architecture of the evening, necessary, unseen, and quietly burdened. This reliance revealed how dependent elegance was on hidden hands, steady and silent behind every gesture. Other factors shaped this fragile balance, pressing women further into quiet negotiations with their own clothing. Beneath the surface, the next challenge waited in the layers of their attire. Beneath the elaborate gowns and layers of fabric worn by Victorian women lay a garment few outside their circles ever saw, yet one that shaped every private moment of the night. This undergarment, open at the crotch or entirely split into two separate legs, existed not for comfort or style, but for practicality, quietly dictated by the constraints of fashion. Its presence created an unexpected contrast. An age known for strict propriety embraced an underlayer that openly defied modesty, all in the name of survival within the clothing they themselves celebrated. The structure of this garment appeared simple at first glance. Two separate panels draped over the legs, leaving a gap in the center. There were no buttons, ties, or closures, nothing to undo, nothing to fasten. The split hung naturally hidden beneath petticoats, corsets, and the rigid structure of the crinoline. Women stepped into it as they would any other piece of clothing, but its true purpose did not become clear until necessity forced their hand. The gap allowed the body to be accessed without removing a single layer, a vital function when gowns weighed nearly as much as the person wearing them. Its practicality revealed itself most sharply during moments when time was limited and privacy scarce. Women could not waste minutes unfastening stays or stepping out of heavy fabrics. Retiring rooms were small, dim, and often occupied. Hesitation risked drawing attention. With the open crotch design, a woman needed only to lift her layers, still a complicated task requiring assistance, and the garment simply allowed access without further struggle. The adage of the era might well have been that clothing designed to be excessive required an underlayer designed for speed. Despite its usefulness, the garment's existence carried a sense of contradiction. Victorian society prided itself on modesty, yet this item deliberately avoided covering the very place modesty sought to protect. Women who wore it did not discuss it. Servants who assisted with it never mentioned it, even among themselves. The silence surrounding the garment reflected an unspoken rule: some truths were necessary, but unfit for conversation. Instead, the garment became part of an internal world, shared only by women and their maids, hidden beneath layers that symbolized propriety while concealing a practicality that contradicted it. Servants were often the ones most familiar with its function. They saw how it allowed their mistresses to avoid complete disrobing, how it saved precious minutes in cramped retiring rooms, how it prevented accidents that could ruin an entire evening. Their hands lifted skirts and steadied crinolines while ensuring the open section aligned where it needed to. Their expertise made the garment's design work as intended. Without their knowledge, the practicality of the piece would have mattered little. The material varied depending on the class. Wealthier women wore lightweight cotton or fine linen trimmed with lace, even though its appearance mattered little beneath the many layers of clothing. Working-class women used rougher fabric, durable and easier to wash. Yet the structural concept remained the same across classes, a gap that turned a complicated process into a manageable one. It represented, in its own discreet way, the only part of Victorian fashion that acknowledged women's bodies needed functionality as much as ornamentation. The garment also influenced how women moved. Knowing the underlayer was open added a subtle awareness to their posture, especially when seated or lifted by dance partners. Petticoats and outer skirts provided sufficient coverage, but the knowledge lingered quietly, shaping the way women positioned themselves. The sense of exposure was psychological rather than physical, a reminder that their clothing was not as secure as it appeared. Even though the design was invisible from the outside, the internal awareness shaped their movement with an added layer of self-control. Lighting in the retiring rooms amplified this tension. Shadows shifted as candles flickered, creating pockets of darkness, where the garment's opening felt more exposed, even when no one could see it. A woman relied entirely on her maid to protect her dignity, trusting that the lifting of skirts, the position of the crinoline, and the placement of screens created just enough concealment. This dynamic deepened the intimacy between mistress and servant, binding them in a private ritual that the outside world pretended did not exist. Its strangeness becomes clearer when considered alongside the strict moral codes of the era. Public behavior was governed by layers of rules. Yet underneath those rules sat a garment designed specifically to bypass the very barriers society insisted on. Fashion demanded volume, structure, and weight. Practicality demanded a way to navigate that structure without humiliation. The solution came in the form of an opening, hidden beneath multiple layers, a secret compromise between expectation and reality. The garment also revealed how deeply clothing shaped women's lives. Even basic bodily needs had to be approached, strategically adapted to the limitations imposed by fashion. A design that might seem shocking today was, in that context, a quiet act of survival against the burdens placed upon them. Victorian women endured these contradictions daily, balancing the image they were required to maintain against the hidden adaptations that made that image possible. Women then returned to the ballroom, their movements controlled, their expressions calm, carrying with them the private knowledge of the garment hidden beneath. They smiled, danced, and glided across polished floors, as though nothing complicated lay beneath their gowns. Guests admired the elegance. No one considered the mechanisms that allowed that elegance to remain intact. This concealed design exposed the uneasy balance between decorum and practicality, woven into every layer of their clothing. Other details within their attire created similar contradictions, shaping the choices they made throughout the evening. Behind the glow of the ballroom, another compromise rested quietly in the shadows. Every Victorian ballroom shimmered with light music and movement, yet beneath the layered gowns that circled the floor lay a truth that everyone quietly acknowledged, but never dared to speak aloud. The open-crotch undergarment already hidden under petticoats, and the rigid architecture of the crinoline became an unspoken uniform for nearly every woman attending these gatherings. It was a design so essential that its absence would have made the night nearly impossible to endure. At the same time, it remained a topic sealed away by silence, existing only in glances exchanged between maids and mistresses, never in conversation. Women accepted this garment as part of the architecture of their clothing, the same way they accepted corsets, padding, and structural metal frames. Yet the cultural discomfort surrounding its purpose pushed it into the realm of shared secrecy. No one needed to explain why it was there. The difficulties of navigating heavy skirts and distant retiring rooms made the reason self-evident. Even young girls preparing for their first formal events learned quickly that elegance required compromises hidden from the polished world above. Inside the retiring rooms, this secrecy became its own presence. The garment's open design simplified a process that would otherwise have demanded complete, undressing and action impossible during crowded events. Women stepped into these dim rooms, with their maids lifting layers of fabric, breathing carefully within the tight grip of corsets. The gap in the undergarment allowed them to act quickly, silently, and without disturbing the delicate arrangement of their clothing. It was a practical solution in a culture that demanded impractical beauty. Despite its necessity, the garment created a tension that lingered beneath the surface of every movement. The knowledge of its openness settled into the background of a woman's awareness, never visible, never addressed, yet always present. It shaped posture, guided gestures, and influenced how women stood, sat, and danced. They relied on layers of fabric to shield them, yet those same layers reminded them of the vulnerability they carried with them throughout the night. Servants understood this tension intimately. They were the ones who lifted the skirts, adjusted the crinoline, and positioned screens to offer as much privacy as possible. Maids often moved with an almost choreographed precision, aware that even a small shift of fabric could expose more than intended. Their hands worked swiftly, quietly, forming a protective barrier between their mistress and the rest of the world. To them, the open crotch design was not a curiosity. It was a tool they had learned to manage through experience. The garment's existence also revealed a deeper contradiction in Victorian values. Publicly, the era celebrated modesty, restraint, and rigid social codes. Privately, women depended on a design that openly acknowledged their physical needs. The contrast between outward refinement and hidden practicality created a quiet tension that defined much of Victorian fashion. It served as a reminder that the spectacle of elegance demanded solutions that could never be openly admitted. Even the materials of the garment whispered something about the world it belonged to. Lightweight cotton, fine linen, or lace trim created an appearance far more delicate than its purpose required. The softness of the fabric contradicted the heaviness of the skirts it supported. The garment's beauty, though rarely seen, suggested a desire to dignify what society insisted on ignoring. It functioned in silence, but was crafted with care, as though its makers understood that even secrets deserved attention. Movement became a form of negotiation. Women balanced the structural weight of their gowns with the hidden vulnerability of the undergarment. Each step onto the dance floor, each curtsy, each turn required trust. Trust in their maids, in the layers of fabric, and in the illusion of modesty that Victorian society so fiercely protected. No spectator watching a waltz could have imagined the delicate balance beneath the swirling skirts, the quiet engineering that allowed the performance of elegance to continue uninterrupted. The open crotch design also influenced how women perceived themselves during these events. Beneath the rigid outer clothing that shaped their bodies into fashionable silhouettes lay a garment that granted them a small measure of freedom. It challenged the idea that Victorian fashion placed women entirely under constraint. Instead, it revealed a subtle practicality, a recognition, however discreet, that women needed to move, breathe, and manage their bodies even in the midst of ceremonial expectations. Yet this practicality did not erase the unease surrounding the garment. Many women carried an unspoken discomfort, sensing the contradiction between the appearance they presented and the secret their clothing concealed. It was a reminder that beneath the grandeur of Victorian society lay a network of hidden adaptations designed to sustain the illusion of perfection. No one discussed these adaptations not because they were shameful, but because the illusion depended on silence. This design endured for decades because it worked. It allowed women to glide across rooms illuminated by chandeliers, to spend hours on their feet, and to navigate estates that lacked adequate facilities. It solved a problem without disturbing the carefully built facade of propriety that defined the era. And yet its effectiveness came at the cost of constant awareness of the fragility of appearances, of the reliance on servants, and of the delicate interplay between concealment and necessity. Even after leaving the retiring room, women continued to carry that awareness. Their faces remained calm, their steps measured, their movements graceful. No gesture betrayed the quiet truth beneath their skirts. The garment returned to its silent role, part of the hidden machinery that made Victorian beauty possible. This hidden design revealed how deeply Victorian society relied on silence to preserve the illusion of refinement. Other tools within a woman's private world carried the same weight, shaping every quiet step behind the glittering halls. A deeper truth lingers just outside the edges of their carefully constructed elegance. Some Victorian households, eager to maintain uninterrupted elegance during long evenings, relied on a solution that blended practicality with disguise: the portable commode chair. Placed in retiring rooms or small adjoining chambers, the chair looked almost indistinguishable from ordinary furniture. Upholstered cushions, polished legs, and carved ornamentation masked the hidden compartment beneath the seat. To a casual observer, it appeared no different from the chairs scattered throughout the house. Yet women who attended these gatherings understood its purpose immediately, and servants knew exactly when it would be needed. The design followed a simple logic. A hinged seat lifted to reveal a ceramic or metal chamber pot fitted neatly within the wooden frame. When the lid was closed, the chair seemed harmless, even decorative. But its function became vital during long nights when distant corridors, dim staircases, and crowded hallways made it difficult for women to reach other facilities. The commode chair occupied a space between necessity and secrecy, an object that served an essential purpose while hiding in plain sight. Retiring rooms were the natural environment for such chairs. These rooms were meant to offer a moment's pause, a place where women could adjust their gowns, collect themselves, or step away from the intensity of the ballroom. The commode chair sat quietly among vanities, screens, and cushioned stools, waiting for a woman who needed privacy quickly. A maid would guide her mistress into the room, position the chair behind a folding screen, and prepare the layers of fabric in silence. Using the chair required a practiced coordination, similar to that used with slop jars, yet the setting felt slightly less harsh. The padding on the seat gave the moment a strange softness, a reminder that the object had been designed for comfort, even as it performed a task few wanted to acknowledge. The maid lifted the heavy skirts, steadied the crinoline, and adjusted the chair to make the opening of the split drawers accessible. Everything depended on precision. The slightest misalignment risked stained fabric or exposed movement mistakes no woman could afford during a social event defined by poise. Lighting in these rooms remained dim, even more so than in the hallways. A single candle or gas lamp cast shifting shadows across the screen. The glow softened the edges of the chair, making it seem less like a practical tool and more like a quiet intruder in a room meant for elegance. Women lowered themselves cautiously, trusting their maids to keep the layers of clothing from collapsing inward. The room's silence deepened, broken only by the faint rustling of fabric and the delicate click of the hinged seat. Once finished, the maid closed the chair, straightened the skirts, and ensured that every fold returned to its perfect place. The chair would then be moved slightly aside or covered with a draped cloth until the next woman needed it. Servants later removed the pot beneath the seat, emptying it with a practiced discretion that kept the household's reputation intact. Their labor ensured that the commode chair remained an invisible aid, rather than a disruption to the carefully engineered elegance of the evening. The presence of such a chair reflected a peculiar balance in Victorian society. Women were expected to remain graceful for hours, dancing in tightly cinched corsets and carrying the weight of elaborate gowns. Yet the homes hosting these events often lacked functional bathrooms. The commode chair became a compromise, a bridge between the demands of social decorum and the unavoidable needs of the body. It was neither fully public nor truly private, occupying a liminal space defined by silence. Its existence also revealed the layered relationship between women and their maids. Trust had to be absolute. A maid not only assisted with the physical act, but also guarded her mistress's dignity, positioning the screen, adjusting the skirt, securing the crinoline, and ensuring the room remained undisturbed. All of it depended on her vigilance. In these moments, the hierarchy between mistress and servant blurred, slightly replaced by a shared understanding of vulnerability concealed beneath the show of refinement. The structure of the chair itself spoke to the ingenuity of the era. Artisans built them to resemble common furniture, with thoughtful details meant to draw the eye away from their purpose. Some chairs featured carved wooden legs, velvet cushions, or curved armrests. Others remained modest in appearance, blending with wallpapered rooms or dark paneling to avoid attention. Their disguise was successful enough that visitors unfamiliar with their function might sit in them unknowingly, unaware of the hollow compartment hidden below. What made the commode chair particularly striking was how seamlessly it fit into a world obsessed with propriety. Women could not discuss bodily needs openly, yet they routinely used objects built specifically to handle those needs discreetly. Conversations in parlors, invitations delivered with perfect etiquette, and carefully arranged bouquets filled the evening, while behind a screen in a quiet room, a chair with a hidden pot allowed the event to continue without interruption. The contradiction lived at the heart of Victorian life appearance, guided everything, even when it forced practicality into elaborate disguises. Women returned to the ballroom afterward, with composed faces and measured steps, their movements betraying nothing of the moment spent in the retiring room. They took partners for the next dance, lifted their skirts gracefully, and glided across polished floors. No one watching the scene would imagine the quiet machinery that supported their elegance furniture, disguised as decoration maids, working in shadows and decisions shaped entirely by clothing, designed without concern for ease. The chair remained in the retiring room, waiting silently for the next woman who needed it, a witness to countless hidden moments that would never be spoken of. This disguised piece of furniture exposed how deeply practicality hid beneath layers of elegance during a Victorian ball. Other silent challenges shaped the night, just as strongly influencing every choice women made within those crowded rooms. Quiet tension settled close to the music, waiting to reveal what came next in their struggle for composure. Timing mattered almost as much as appearance in a Victorian ballroom. Women moved through the night, aware that every entrance and exit carried meaning. Every pause in dancing invited speculation, and every deviation from expected rhythm risked becoming a subject of quiet conversation. Leaving the dance floor for personal reasons was never simple. It required calculation, restraint, and a careful reading of the room, as though the simplest needs of the body had to be negotiated through layers of etiquette. A woman could not slip away casually. The dances were arranged in sequences, and partners expected her presence at appointed moments. Stepping aside without warning might offend someone, disappoint a partner, or reveal an inconsistency in her composure. The ballroom's bright lights and constant motion amplified the awareness of being watched. Even a brief absence could draw more attention than she intended. Every exit risked appearing abrupt, inappropriate, or poorly timed. The pressure deepened as the music continued. The waltz circled the room in sweeping arcs, while other dances progressed in strict geometric patterns. A woman needed to decide whether she could endure another set or find a moment between partner changes to excuse herself. But even those transitions were crowded with eyes, gestures, and expectations. Leaving too often seemed improper. Leaving too rarely became uncomfortable. Women learned to read subtle cues in the night, shaping their choices around the rhythm of the music, rather than the urgency within their own bodies. Conversation among guests added another layer of difficulty. People observed who stayed on the floor, who stepped away, and how long they remained gone. A woman who excused herself too frequently might appear anxious or unwell, inviting sympathy she did not want or suspicion she could not afford. Victorian society valued steadiness, and any hint of discomfort threatened that image. Guests judged quickly, often quietly weaving assumptions from the smallest shifts in behavior. The tight clothing further complicated decisions. Corsets compressed the abdomen, limiting breath and intensifying the sense of pressure. Heavy skirts demanded effort simply to lift, let alone navigate through doorways or crowds. Women felt the weight with every passing minute. Yet even when discomfort pressed sharply, etiquette insisted that they maintain an unbroken facade of calm. They raised their chins, steadied their posture, and continued dancing as though nothing stirred beneath the surface. Partners sometimes noticed hesitation, though few addressed it directly. A slight pause in movement, a faint shift in weight, or a brief tightening of the hand might reveal the internal conflict. Still, men were trained to ignore such signs, to lead smoothly through the dance without acknowledging anything amiss. In this silence, women carried the burden of deciding when and how to step away without disturbing the flow of the evening. The layout of the ballroom created additional obstacles. Exits were often positioned at the far end of the room, forcing women to cross the floor under the gaze of dozens of guests. Courteous as they appeared, those guests watched everything: dresses, gestures, glances, even the pacing of someone's steps. A woman who moved too quickly risked revealing urgency. A woman who moved too slowly appeared hesitant. Both extremes could invite questions she did not want to answer. Retiring rooms, though available, were often crowded or occupied. Women might wait outside for a moment of privacy, but doing so prolonged their absence and increased the risk of drawing attention. Even when the room was empty, the process inside required time, lifting layers, adjusting the crinoline, coordinating movements with the maid. Nothing could be rushed regardless of how urgently she needed relief. Returning to the ballroom demanded another calculation, choosing the right moment to slip back into the patterns of the dance without interrupting anyone. These calculations were not discussed openly. They were passed quietly from mother to daughter, learned through observation rather than instruction. Young women attending their first ball quickly discovered that endurance was part of the performance. They watched other women study their timing and mirrored the discrete patterns that allowed them to manage discomfort without attracting notice. In this way, the social fabric sustained itself through imitation and silence. The discomfort of waiting grew sharper as the night progressed. Hours of standing, dancing, and drinking small amounts of champagne added to the strain. Yet many women preferred to endure rather than risk leaving at the wrong moment. The expectation of grace demanded sacrifice. Some forced themselves to breathe slowly through discomfort. Others shifted weight subtly to ease pressure. Still others simply waited silently, counting the remaining dances until they could safely step away. As the ballroom swelled with heat and movement, the urgency intensified. Sweat dampened the edges of corsets and breath grew shallower. But women continued their movements in a steady rhythm, preserving the illusion that the night required nothing more than elegance. The internal struggle remained hidden beneath polished expressions and deliberate steps. What made this difficulty even sharper was the knowledge that a single miscalculated exit could create whispers powerful enough to overshadow an entire evening. Women bore the responsibility of maintaining not just their comfort, but their reputation, navigating their needs through a maze of rules that were rarely considered. The pressure to appear unaffected shaped every choice they made, reinforcing the silent demands of the ballroom. This constant negotiation revealed how tightly etiquette controlled even the smallest decisions in a woman's night. Other forces shaped her restraint with equal weight, tightening expectations until they pressed against the limits of endurance. Subtle strain drifted close to the chandeliers, hinting at pressures that would soon reshape her movements. Retiring rooms in Victorian ballrooms served as small pockets of retreat carved away from the noise, heat, and scrutiny of the dance floor. Softly lit and arranged with modest elegance, these spaces offered a fragile sense of relief to women who had spent hours balancing the demands of etiquette, clothing, and physical endurance. A typical retiring room held mirrors framed in gilt or dark wood cushioned seats arranged along the walls, and a narrow table cluttered with hairpins, ribbons, or discarded gloves. Everything appeared calm, controlled, and faintly perfumed, as though the room wished to present itself as a sanctuary, despite the tension that followed every woman inside. The mirrors were often the first objects to draw attention. They reflected not simply a woman's face, but the strain at the corners of her expression, the tightening introduced by corsets, The pressure of heat beneath layers of fabric, the faint flush from constant movement on the dance floor. Women approached these mirrors, quietly adjusting curls that had loosened or smoothing gloves that had begun to wrinkle. Their pauses seemed graceful, yet beneath that surface lingered fatigue. Every reflection carried hints of the effort required to maintain composure in a room where beauty was expected to appear effortless. Seating in these rooms played a practical role. The chairs, settees, and stools allowed women to rest their legs after hours of dancing. Their cushions absorbed not only weight but tension. A woman might sink into them briefly, catching her breath, steadying her posture, or easing the pressure of her corset. But rest was never complete. The knowledge that the ballroom continued without her cast a subtle pull, reminding her that the moment of relief could not last long. She remained aware of the need to return before her absence drew questions. Some retiring rooms contained commode chairs or slop jars concealed behind screens. Their presence created a quiet divide between the delicate decor and the raw practicality required by the evening. Women who entered these corners of the room carried the same mixture of urgency and restraint that shaped every hidden moment of the night. Maids moved with soft steps, lifting skirts, adjusting crinolines, and returning everything to order before anyone else entered. These small acts of maintenance preserved the illusion that retiring rooms existed only for beauty and conversation, not for the realities they quietly managed. Despite their intended calm, these rooms often became crowded during large gatherings. Women sought them for countless reasons: exhaustion, discomfort, heat, or necessity, and the limited number of spaces could not always accommodate the demand. At times, several women waited near the entrance, fans moving slowly in the warm air, their faces composed even as impatience flickered in their eyes. The gentle decor of the room offered little comfort when dozens of guests needed the same brief escape. The tension increased when privacy became scarce. Conversations dropped to whispers. Footsteps slowed out of courtesy. Women waited with the same discipline they applied to the dance floor, maintaining stillness even when their bodies urged otherwise. Each minute spent waiting heightened discomfort, yet none dared express frustration. Showing strain risked attracting attention, and attention threatened to unravel the veneer of calm they worked so hard to maintain. Maids navigated the room with a practiced awareness of its limitations. They anticipated when their mistresses needed assistance, guided them toward openings between screens, and shielded them with their bodies when necessary. Their presence made the room function even when it overflowed with guests. Without them, the retiring room would have collapsed into disarray, revealing the fragile scaffolding beneath the evening's elegance. The decor itself contributed to the illusion of tranquility. Soft wallpaper, floral arrangements, and polished wood were arranged carefully to give the impression of gentility. Little of it reflected reality. The floral scent masked heat and sweat. The wallpaper concealed drafts from the hallways. The polished surfaces reflected faces strained from corsetry. The retiring room was less a sanctuary than a temporary pause, a controlled space where discomfort acquired a brief disguise. Even so, the room carried emotional weight. For some women, it offered a moment of clarity, a chance to inhale deeply, to steady their shaking hands, or to collect the pieces of themselves scattered by the night's expectations. For others, it served as a silent reminder of the constraints imposed by their clothing, their roles, and the social gaze that followed them everywhere. To stand in a retiring room was to confront the difference between appearance and reality framed by mirrors that captured every detail. Women returned to the ballroom with slow, measured steps. Their faces held no trace of the pressure they had endured. Their gowns resumed their perfect shapes, supported by maids who moved unseen. Whatever had taken place in the retiring room, rest, relief, and adjustment, disappeared beneath the glow of chandeliers and the rising swell of music. The room remained behind them, ready to receive the next woman who needed its brief shelter. Yet the underlying truth remained constant. The retiring room, though designed to appear gentle, bore the weight of every hidden need. Its quiet corners carried stories of restraint, endurance, and compromise that the ballroom never acknowledged. This delicate space revealed how tightly women balanced grace against necessity throughout the night. Other pressures converged just as quietly, shaping how they endured hours of movement and intense scrutiny. Further strains waited in the crowded air, weaving deeper into the rhythm of the evening. Hallways surrounding Victorian ballrooms carried a different kind of rhythm from the music echoing inside. While the guests danced, laughed, and maintained the polished image expected of them, The maids stationed just beyond the glow of chandeliers moved according to a quieter, more disciplined order. Their presence remained mostly unseen, yet they held the structure of the evening together, with steady awareness and practiced precision. Every gesture, every step, and every instinct they relied on had been shaped by nights like this, where elegance survived only because someone else carried the hidden weight. Maids often positioned themselves near doorways or behind heavy curtains that framed the entrances to retiring rooms. These places allowed them to observe without intruding, to anticipate needs without appearing forward, and to remain close enough to respond rapidly when their mistress signaled for assistance. They stood in shadows, softened by candlelight, hands placed neatly before them, their posture suggesting calm readiness. To the untrained eye, they appeared idle. In truth, they were scanning the corridor constantly, gauging movements, timing, and subtle shifts that might require intervention. Their primary duty was guidance. When a woman stepped out of the ballroom, her gown rustling with layers of fabric and metal understructure, a maid would quietly step forward to escort her. She chose the path with the fewest obstacles, avoiding crowded hallways, stray objects, or drafts that might disturb elaborate hairstyles. Her role was not merely to show direction, but to preserve dignity while doing so. Each movement had to remain discreet, a silent act of protection that kept the illusion of effortless grace intact. Technical assistance formed another essential part of their work. Crinolines shifted, bustles tilted, hems caught on shoes, and corset laces loosened under strain. Maids recognized these problems instantly. A slight hesitation in a woman's walk, a hand pressed too firmly against her waist, or the discreet tremor of a fan could signal trouble. With minimal words, they adjusted, straps, straightened, panels, tightened laces, or guided their mistress to a more private place where repairs could occur. Their actions were swift but gentle, preserving both the garment and the composure of the woman wearing it. One of the quietest responsibilities involved preventing accidents. A fallen pin, a bent hoop, or a misaligned fastening could turn a graceful descent down a staircase into a dangerous moment. Maids checked surfaces before their mistresses stepped onto them, ensuring that nothing unexpected interfered with movement. They learned to predict patterns when a woman might feel faint from heat, when she might need water, or when she might approach the limits imposed by her corset. Their alertness kept small problems from becoming public distress. Professionalism shaped every decision they made. They avoided eye contact unless invited, kept their breathing shallow to stay quiet, and blended with the walls when not in motion. Their steps created no echo, their voices rarely rose above a whisper, and their hands moved with controlled precision when handling sensitive garments. This discipline preserved a boundary. The mistress remained the visible figure of elegance, while the maid became the mechanism, ensuring that elegance held together. Yet the hallways also carried strain. A maid might serve multiple women at once, each with her own demands and unpredictable needs. She memorized preferences, the angle of a fan, the tightness of a corset, and the speed required for certain adjustments. Between these tasks, she monitored the space, carefully aware that any lapse could bring consequences. Her livelihood depended on reliability, discretion, and impeccable timing. The emotional landscape of these nights was subtle but present. Maids witnessed things others never saw. Trembling hands after hours of dancing, tears quickly wiped away. Before re-entering the ballroom, whispers of anxiety, masked by glittering attire. They remained steady through it all. Their presence offered a reassurance that did not need to be spoken. Even when overwhelmed, they carried out their duties with the same quiet focus, knowing no part of the evening could proceed smoothly without their support. Their work extended into small, unseen gestures. They retrieved dropped items before anyone noticed, brushed dust from hems, tightened gloves, and straightened hairpins that had begun to slip. They offered water or salts discreetly. When someone felt faint, adjusted lighting in retiring rooms, and prepared commode chairs or slop jars when necessary. They maintained order in spaces that remained hidden from guests, ensuring that the flow between ballroom and corridor stayed uninterrupted. Despite the delicate nature of their tasks, maids rarely received acknowledgement. Their successes vanished into the smooth continuation of the night, while any error risked visibility that could jeopardize their position. Still, they performed their roles with dedication, knowing the structure of the event rested more heavily on them than on those who danced beneath the chandeliers. Hallways may have appeared empty, but to the maids standing within them, each moment held purpose. Their attention bridged the gap between beauty and reality, shaping the night in ways unseen by those who believed elegance required no maintenance. Their work sustained the illusion of flawlessness, while navigating the challenges hidden behind every gown and gesture. This silent orchestration revealed how much of the evening rested on hands that never sought the spotlight. Another layer of hidden strain hovered behind the polished surface, waiting to shape the fate of anyone who moved through the crowded ballroom. Something unspoken lingered in the fabric of the night, hinting at troubles no one dared to name. Small mishaps carried a weight that most guests never fully acknowledged, yet they hovered beneath every night of music and ceremony. In the ballroom, the air swirled with perfume, candle smoke, and the rustle of layered gowns, but under that softness lived a constant fear of imperfection. Women who moved with apparent ease carried inside them the knowledge that a single misstep, a moment of physical need that could not be contained, might become the subject of whispered conversations for weeks. The pressure settled quietly on their shoulders, and while the orchestra played, it was always there, shaping the way they held their breath, the way they walked, and the way they planned every minute of their evening. To those who have only read about Victorian balls from a distance, the elegance is often emphasized. People imagine silk gliding across polished floors, chandeliers casting warm light on smiling faces, and polite laughter filling the spaces between the music. What is rarely considered is how vulnerable the women were beneath the surface of that beauty. The heavy skirts, the tight corsets, the fragile fabrics, they all created conditions where even the smallest accident could bloom into humiliation. The body continued its needs, indifferent to the expectations of society, and managing those needs without detection became an unspoken test of discipline. Among those who attended regularly, stories circulated quietly. A young woman who left a faint mark on the floor while hurrying toward a retiring room. Another, whose gown once pristine showed a slight darkening at the hem when she returned from a corner no one paid attention to before. These stories were rarely spoken aloud in public, yet they were known by enough people to cast long shadows. The fear of such judgment shaped the behavior of entire seasons. The knowledge that a single incident could alter how others saw you created a silent tension that every woman carried at her sides, like an invisible cord, stretching tighter as the night progressed. It was not only the potential embarrassment that caused distress. Reputation in Victorian society was an elaborate and fragile structure. Families invested years building it, guarding it, and displaying it at events such as these. The daughter who committed a social error risked more than personal shame. She risked damaging the standing of her entire household. A stain on a skirt was viewed differently than it would be today. It was not dismissed as an accident. It was interpreted as a failure of control, a sign of poor upbringing, or a hint that something in the family was lacking. Even close friends could become harsh observers, their glances sharp, their silence sharper. Servants noticed these anxieties more than anyone. Positioned in corners, stationed in hallways, they moved in and out of scenes without drawing attention. They witnessed the hurried steps, the tightly clasped hands, the expressions that flickered for only a second before smoothing back into composure. They understood that preventing an incident was not merely about practicality. It was about preserving the delicate image their employers presented to the world. Some worked with swift, practiced efficiency. Others learned through mistakes, burdened by the guilt of knowing that their hesitation might have contributed to a moment of discomfort. The architecture of grand houses added to the risk. Floors echoed footsteps, making discreet departures difficult. Fabrics caught small droplets of anything, no matter how faint, and transformed them into visible reminders. Lighting from chandeliers cast downward shadows that revealed textures and marks easily. Even the faintest trace could be seen by someone who wished to see it. And among the hundreds of eyes in a ballroom, there were always a few that searched for precisely that: flaws, weaknesses, anything that could ripple outward as gossip. Guests who prided themselves on grace felt the constant pressure of this reality. They moved carefully, almost calculating each gesture. When laughter rose, it was shaped by restraint. When they paused near open windows for fresh air, they did so with an awareness that stepping too far from the group invited speculation. They maintained an inner stillness that contradicted the lively music surrounding them. Beneath the surface of celebration lived an unbroken thread of vigilance woven through hours of dancing and smiling. For some women, the fear became physical. Muscles tensed from holding too long breaths, shortened from corsets tightened more than usual, and eyes scanned the room for the nearest exit that would not draw notice. The body's quiet urgency pushed against layers of fabric and layers of social rules, but neither could be disrupted. They waited through entire sets of dances, clinging to composure, even when their comfort eroded. The triumph of a successful evening was often measured not by the dances performed, but by what remained unseen. The scandal came not from intention, but from visibility. A blot, a scent, a shadow on fabric, small things that should have meant nothing, were enough for rumors to ignite. Once begun, nothing stopped them. They traveled faster than the music itself, reshaping reputations in their wake. And in such an environment, caution became a survival strategy. As the ballroom glimmered with movement, the truth remained: the night rewarded perfection and punished any deviation from it. Every woman knew this, even if she never spoke it aloud. A single misplaced drop could unravel an entire season's carefully built reputation. Every gesture of elegance depended on silence, yet that silence trembled under the weight of watching eyes. Something far more oppressive waited in the rooms where heat and thirst pressed against every choice. Ballrooms during Victorian nights were often sealed spaces, where heat rose quickly and lingered long after the music began. Heavy fabrics, dense crowds, and candle-lit walls created an atmosphere that tightened around every guest, pressing closest to the women, who were already burdened by layered clothing and rigid expectations. The air thickened with warmth and breath, building hour by hour, until every movement felt heavier than the last. Under those conditions, staying composed required far more than elegance. It demanded endurance that few admitted to, and even fewer discussed once the night was over. Women entered these rooms, determined to maintain the image expected of them, yet the warmth made the challenge far more complicated. Sweat gathered beneath corsets along the edges of gloves, and at the base of the neck where hair was pinned tightly. Each step across polished floors added another trace of exertion, though no one dared let it reach their expression. Appearances mattered, and the illusion of ease had to hold through the entire evening, regardless of how the heat pressed into their bodies. While the room grew increasingly stifling, refreshments continued to circulate. Trays of tea, punch, champagne, and chilled drinks passed from hand to hand, offered as relief from the rising temperature. Women accepted them, because refusing too often could be seen as rude, and the cooling sensation felt welcome in a setting that rarely offered true comfort. But every sip, every polite drink, taken out of courtesy or habit, added to a growing problem no one spoke openly about. The more they drank, the more their bodies pushed back. Heat and exertion made dehydration a real risk, especially when dancing required extended physical effort. Yet drinking to stay steady meant increasing the likelihood of needing relief, at a time when reaching a toilet was anything but simple. The logic was circular: an exhausting drink too little, and risk faintness; drink too much, and risk an urgent need. That etiquette made nearly impossible to address without careful calculation. Women learned to measure each swallow with silent precision, counting not only what they consumed, but estimating how long they could wait before seeking a private space. With each passing hour, the tension grew. The heat softened concentration, making every decision feel heavier. The layered fabrics did little to help trapping warmth and raising body temperature even further. Corsets compressed the ribcage, making breathing shallow, which only intensified the sense of fatigue. Despite these conditions, women still had to move gracefully across the floor, keeping pace with partners and maintaining perfect posture, while sweat gathered beneath the multiple layers of their dresses. There was no open acknowledgement of the discomfort. Victorian social events demanded a level of composure that left no room for physical strain. Women endured silently, even when the heat became overwhelming, because fainting was more acceptable than admitting a need to step away for bodily relief. This strange hierarchy of suffering reflected how deeply appearances shaped behavior. A woman could collapse from heat and still be considered elegant, but leaving the room too often risked whispers and raised eyebrows. Inside these crowded spaces, every woman developed her own strategy. Some avoided champagne because its effects came quickly. Others limited themselves to a single cup of tea early in the evening, knowing the heat would amplify its consequences. A few tried to drink water before arriving, hoping early hydration would carry them through the night. None of these methods guaranteed success, but all of them revealed how much deliberate planning sat behind the smooth exterior presented to the world. The ballroom's design also contributed to the difficulty. High ceilings and thick walls trapped warmth rather than releasing it. Candlelight, though beautiful, added constant heat to the environment. Musicians and dancers created movement that stirred the air, but it rarely cooled the room. Instead, it pushed warm currents from one corner to another. By midnight, the atmosphere felt heavier, closing in more tightly with every new dance. Women understood this pattern, though they never mentioned it aloud. It was simply part of the night accepted, because there was no alternative. Even when the heat became nearly unbearable, women could not simply excuse themselves without careful timing. Leaving in the middle of a dance was unthinkable. Leaving too often raised suspicion. Leaving with visible urgency was a social misstep few dared risk. The pressure built with every hour, shaping their choices so quietly that even they did not realize how much the atmosphere controlled their behavior. The heat was not just a physical burden. It was a force that dictated movement, restraint, and the subtle calculations hidden beneath every graceful gesture. Some women tried to stay near open windows, hoping for a breath of cooler air, but windows were frequently shut to prevent drafts or preserve modesty. Others gravitated toward less crowded corners, though these spaces filled quickly as the night progressed. Still, they pressed on, adjusting their movements, slowing their sips, and enduring the rising discomfort while maintaining the illusion of ease that society demanded. Under these conditions, the need to manage bodily functions became an unspoken battle running parallel to the elegance of the evening. Each drink, each bead of sweat, each breath of warm air added another layer of tension to a night already shaped by strict rules. This balancing act never appeared in the photographs or the stories told afterward. It existed only in the lived experience of the women who had no choice but to bear it. This rising heat exposed how fragile composure could become under hours of strain. Every choice a woman made carried weight, tightening the boundaries within which she had to move. A deeper discomfort waited behind the warmth, shaped by settings where secrecy and risk blended more closely than anyone wished to admit. Outdoor gatherings held in the countryside introduced a different set of challenges for women, especially when the evening extended late into the night. These events often took place far from established estates or towns, in open fields or makeshift venues created just for the occasion. Without permanent facilities, the issue of sanitation became a quiet but persistent concern that shaped each woman's experience. She had to navigate a setting where privacy was scarce, lighting was minimal, and the structures provided were fragile substitutes for real protection. Temporary privies were usually assembled behind clusters of trees or beside tents set up for food, music, or rest. These structures consisted of simple wooden frames or cloth partitions barely stable and offering almost no true separation from the surroundings. In daylight, they already felt exposed. At night, they grew even more precarious, as darkness swallowed the edges and made every step uncertain. Women who approached them had to do so with caution, knowing that a single misplaced foot could turn a private need into an unwanted spectacle. The lack of lighting intensified the vulnerability. Lanterns were rarely provided because organizers prioritized illuminating the main event areas. Beyond the reach of those lights, the landscape became a mass of shadows that moved with the slightest wind. Women relied on memory, faint moonlight, or the dim outline of tents to locate the makeshift facilities. In such conditions, their judgment had to remain steady, despite fatigue and the uncertainty of the terrain. Every quiet walk into the dark required more nerve than anyone openly acknowledged. These temporary spaces offered no locks, which meant women had to operate with a constant awareness of who might be nearby. At any moment, another guest could wander too close, unaware of who or what was behind a thin sheet of fabric. The fear of accidental intrusion shaped the pace and tension of each woman's actions, forcing her to move quickly without disturbing the structure around her. Maintaining balance, managing her layers of clothing, and staying alert to approaching sounds became an unspoken test, one more burden in an already demanding night. The conditions of the ground added further challenges. Soil softened by evening moisture or trampled by guests could shift unexpectedly underfoot. Grass hid uneven patches that threatened to twist ankles or cause slips, especially for women wearing delicate shoes. Even a small fall risked staining a gown or causing injury, and both outcomes carried social consequences. The idea of appearing disheveled after a visit to the privy added an extra layer of anxiety, tightening the expectations already placed upon them. Attempts to create privacy often failed. Whether formed by wooden planks or cloth walls, these structures could not fully block sound. A dress brushing against fabric, a shoe adjusting position, or the faint movement of metal hoops under a skirt, all could be heard by anyone passing nearby. Women were acutely aware of this, shaping every gesture to minimize signs of their presence. Silence became a fragile shield they clung to, hoping it would protect them from unwanted attention. The weather also influenced the difficulty. A sudden gust of wind could lift a partition, revealing more than intended. Rain could soften the ground further, turning the area into mud that clung to hems or splashed against shoes. Cold air made the experience uncomfortable, while warm, humid nights amplified the smell and staleness of the privies. Each condition added to the physical strain, silently working against the composure women fought to maintain. Despite all this, attending such events meant accepting these inconveniences. Victorian social expectations did not ease simply because the setting changed. A woman was still expected to appear graceful, controlled, and untroubled, even if she had to walk into darkness alone to use a facility that barely shielded her. The contrast between the celebration's elegance and the crude reality behind it became sharper in rural settings. The bright music and polished manners in the main gathering stood in stark opposition to the instability and exposure waiting just beyond the lantern's glow. Women developed their own methods to manage these challenges. Some memorized the terrain during daylight, studying where the privies were placed, so their nighttime movements would be more certain. Others waited for moments when fewer people were nearby, calculating gaps between dances or transitions in music. A few formed informal agreements with trusted companions, who would stand at a distance to ensure no one wandered too close. Each strategy represented another way women tried to maintain dignity in circumstances that offered almost none. These privies, though crude, were essential. Without them, women would have faced even greater discomfort. They accepted the risks, because the alternative, enduring through the entire night without relief, was nearly impossible. Still, the tension that accompanied each visit lingered, shaping their memories of these gatherings and influencing how they approached future events in similar rural settings. In the quiet moments between dances, when the music softened and the night pressed more closely around the field, the existence of these makeshift facilities created an undercurrent of unease. They served as a reminder that beneath the polished surface of celebration lay a fragile infrastructure held together by necessity rather than refinement. The demands placed upon women did not lessen simply because the surroundings were less formal. In many ways, the expectations grew heavier, matching the uncertainty of the environment. These crude outdoor arrangements revealed how women had to navigate both the landscape and the social rules pressed into every evening. The instability surrounding them shaped each movement they made beyond the main gathering. Subtle pressure gathered beneath their layered clothing, hinting at discomfort that would tighten even more once the weight of their gowns entered the story. Even in the dim light of a Victorian ballroom, the sheer size of women's evening gowns was impossible to ignore. These dresses extended outward in sweeping circles that could reach 2 or even 3 meters in diameter, creating a physical presence that dominated every movement. Layers of fabric, stiffened panels, and reinforced hems gave the gowns their shape, but these same elements created a weight that followed each step like a constant reminder of how restricted the wearer truly was. What seemed graceful from afar revealed its burdens only when a woman tried to perform even the smallest action without assistance. Managing such a gown required constant awareness. Every shift of the body had to account for the fabric's volume, the metal supports beneath the outer layers, and the delicate embellishments that could snag or tear with the slightest misstep. Women learned early that turning too quickly risked pulling the dress off balance, and sitting without preparation could crush the structure beneath them. All of these details added invisible labor to their night, a quiet calculation running beneath the polished surface of their appearance. Corsets added another barrier to movement. They bound the torso tightly, compressing the ribcage and limiting breath to shallow, controlled patterns. The longer the evening lasted, the more noticeable this confinement became. The weight of the gown, combined with the pressure of the corset, created a strain that settled into the shoulders, back, and hips. Gloves, often made of silk or kid leather, restricted the fingers further, making it difficult to grasp small objects or adjust a part of the outfit without fumbling. Jewelry added still more limitations. Necklaces pulled at the neck during turns, while bracelets and rings caught on lace or fabric. Despite these challenges, the formal expectation remained unchanged. Women had to move as though none of this troubled them. Their restraint had to appear effortless, even as each gesture required intention and planning. At social events where dancing continued late into the night, this became particularly exhausting. A simple walk across the floor demanded the same attention normally reserved for difficult tasks. The dress shaped everything, including posture, distance, and the pace at which a woman could travel through the room. Using the restroom under such conditions approached the impossible. The gown had to be lifted carefully, not only to prevent it from touching the ground, but also to keep its structure intact. Lifting it alone was rarely possible. The layers were too heavy, too wide, and too stiff for a woman to manage without help. Even raising a portion of the skirt required strength and coordination that the corset made difficult. The inner layers, often as numerous as the outer ones, had their own weight and texture, adding complexity to the process. In private spaces such as retiring rooms or temporary privies during outdoor events, the dress remained a dominant obstacle. The confinement it created did not lessen simply because the surroundings were quieter. Women had to maneuver themselves within narrow or unstable spaces, while managing fabric that demanded far more room than these makeshift facilities provided. Each attempt to lift the layers revealed how tightly the structure resisted movement. The need for assistance became unavoidable, even if the situation called for privacy and speed. Corsets complicated the matter further. Their design restricted bending at the waist, so women could not lean forward naturally to adjust the skirts. Instead, they had to rely on controlled movements made difficult by the pressure on their torso. Breathing became shallow during these efforts, and the strain accumulated quickly. The gloves they wore reduced grip, making it harder to hold onto fabric that slid or resisted. Every part of the outfit asserted its presence, adding friction to a task that already felt tense and urgent. Time also became a factor. During social events, leaving the main room for too long risked drawing attention. Women were expected to reappear promptly unchanged and composed. That expectation created pressure that followed them into the most intimate moments. Even when a woman had assistance, the process of lifting, securing, and adjusting the dress was slow. The minutes stretched under the weight of the gown and the urgency of the need, and every delay added to the anxiety she carried. The dress's elaborate structure also created noise. Fabric layers brushed against each other, metal supports shifted slightly, and embellishments rustled with movement. In narrow, quiet spaces, these sounds felt amplified, reminding women of how difficult it was to conceal what they were trying to do. Maintaining discretion under these circumstances required practice and patience, both of which were expected without ever being openly taught. Women understood that gowns were symbols of status and beauty, but they also understood how much those symbols demanded from them. The discomfort was not simply physical. It shaped their behavior and their choices throughout the night. It determined how often they moved, where they positioned themselves, and how long they could endure the pressure before seeking relief. The gown was a performance, and the effort behind that performance never faded, even when fatigue settled into their limbs. Underneath the surface of celebration, these dresses imposed constraints that touched every part of the evening. They dictated the pace of social interactions, shaped the way women navigated the environment, and added strain to moments that required privacy and precision. What appeared elegant from a distance concealed a slow, quiet struggle within each step. These heavy gowns revealed how deeply appearance dictated a woman's actions throughout the night. Their structure molded every decision she made, tightening her limits with each passing hour. Growing tension settled beneath the ritual of elegance, hinting at a strain that would intensify once silence became the only acceptable response. Silence became one of the most rigid expectations placed upon women during Victorian social events. As the night progressed, and the pressure of layered clothing, rising heat, and bodily needs grew heavier, the demand for composure did not soften. Instead, the higher a woman's status, the more tightly she was expected to control every visible sign of discomfort. Elegance was measured not only by what she wore or how she danced, but by how convincingly she concealed the strain beneath her calm exterior. For women of the upper classes, this restraint began long before they entered the ballroom. They were taught to hold themselves still to avoid fidgeting and to present a face that revealed nothing private. Even small expressions, pressing lips together, adjusting posture, shifting weight, could draw unwanted attention. The fear of creating such signals shaped their behavior, pressing into their bodies with a force that was quieter, but no less real than the weight of their gowns. Once inside the ballroom, the pressure intensified. Women danced through sequences that required precise movements and perfect coordination, even when their bodies ached from tight corsets and heavy fabric. They greeted guests, exchanged polite remarks, and stood for long periods without the relief of sitting or loosening their clothing. Through all of this, they performed a version of stillness that hid physical demands from those around them. Maintaining this illusion consumed energy that no one ever acknowledged. The expectation extended beyond movement. Even the body's natural reactions, sweating, thirst, fatigue, and the growing need to relieve oneself, were considered signs that a woman was not fully in command of herself. She had to manage these sensations without letting a single hint escape. The suppression was so complete that many women learned to anticipate discomfort hours before it became unbearable, shaping their actions long before anyone else noticed the first signs of strain. One of the most difficult burdens to conceal was the increasing urge to use the toilet. As the evening wore on and drinks accumulated, the pressure on the bladder grew, yet a woman could not reveal this need even subtly. Leaving the room too abruptly, or too often risked drawing suspicion. Crossing her legs, or adjusting her stance, hinted at weakness. Even glancing around too frequently could raise questions. Silence was not only about speech, it extended to every signal the body might give. The result was a slow tightening of tension beneath the elegance of the evening. Women stood in crowded rooms surrounded by music and conversation, while quietly negotiating a growing sense of urgency. They trained themselves to breathe shallowly, to hold their muscles still, and to distract their minds from the discomfort building beneath their layered clothing. This invisible labor accompanied each minute of the night, shaping their experience more deeply than the dances themselves. A woman's reputation depended on how well she managed this internal battle. If she appeared strained, gossip could spread. If someone noticed she excused herself too frequently, her composure could be questioned. If she returned looking flushed or slightly disordered, whispers might follow her across the room. The consequences extended far beyond that single evening. Social standing was fragile, and even a small misstep could linger in conversations for an entire season. This silent suffering became part of what defined Victorian beauty. It was not enough to wear fine gowns or follow intricate courtship rituals. A woman was expected to embody calmness so thoroughly that she seemed untouched by physical needs. This standard did not align with reality, but expectations rarely do. Women internalized it because society rewarded those who performed it well and punished those who faltered. The ability to hide discomfort became a symbol of refinement. Even those who faced the greatest discomfort, pregnant women, older women, or those with health conditions, were not spared. Their bodies reacted naturally to strain, yet they were held to the same impossible standard. They endured knowing that any sign of weakness would be scrutinized. The burden was universal, unspoken, and continuous. By the middle of the night, the pressure had accumulated into a quiet ache that followed every step. Women continued to smile, dance, and maintain their posture while their bodies begged for relief. Yet their silence remained intact. It was what society demanded, and what they had learned to demand of themselves. To fail in this silence meant more than discomfort. It meant exposure. The deeper truth is that this expectation of silence ran through every part of Victorian life. Women were trained to endure without complaint, to present beauty without revealing effort, and to suppress needs that might disrupt the illusion of perfection. A ballroom simply concentrated these expectations into a single intense setting. The music, the heat, the gowns, and the eyes watching from every corner all contributed to a night defined by restraint. Inside this restraint, a woman's experience became split. Outwardly, she appeared serene, graceful, entirely composed. Inwardly, she navigated a landscape of discomfort, marked by tight lacing heavy fabric and rising urgency. She carried these two realities at once, and society only acknowledged the surface. This quiet endurance revealed how much elegance depended on what remained hidden. The pressure to appear untouched shaped every gesture a woman made, tightening around her until the strain felt almost constant. Deeper demands waited beneath this silence, pressing harder as expectations continued to rise through the night. Social pressure shaped every movement a woman made during a Victorian ball. Even the simple act of walking across a room carried meaning because eyes lingered everywhere, quietly measuring the behavior of each guest. Among these expectations, one rule weighed heavily than most: a woman should never draw attention to the possibility that she might need to use the toilet. This ordinary human need had to remain invisible. It sat beneath layers of etiquette, shaping her choices long before discomfort appeared. Women knew that moving toward any area associated with privacy could invite speculation. It did not matter whether the destination was a retiring room, a waiting corridor, or a side passage leading away from the ballroom. The path itself created assumptions. Other guests noticed patterns, even subtle ones, and turned them into quiet stories that followed a woman long after the evening ended. Gossip did not need proof. It only required observation. That was enough to create a thread of judgment that could unravel a reputation slowly and silently. This fear became especially intense when the ballroom was crowded. Every inch of space could hold a pair of watching eyes each set, ready to interpret the slightest shift in posture or direction. Women carried this awareness in their bodies, adjusting the pace of their steps, smoothing their facial expressions, and avoiding glances that might suggest urgency. They learned to mask discomfort so completely that even close acquaintances could not detect it. Silence became a form of protection, a shield against the scrutiny that hovered in the air. Leaving the room too quickly risked raising suspicion. Leaving too often risked becoming a subject of whispers. Hesitating before stepping away risked drawing even more attention. This created a narrow path between two dangers, suffering silently or inviting gossip. Women navigated this path with quiet calculation, shaping their choices around the unspoken rules that governed social spaces. The pressure added another layer to the physical strain of their clothing, and the heat of the ballroom turning a private need into a source of anxiety that stretched across the entire evening. The fear of being judged extended beyond simple observation. In Victorian society, moral character was often linked to bodily discipline. A woman who appeared to struggle with physical needs could be interpreted as weak, careless, or lacking refinement. These judgments had real consequences. They could affect a woman's social standing, her future invitations, and in some cases, how potential suitors viewed her suitability. The stakes were far higher than the discomfort she endured. She was not simply protecting her dignity, she was protecting her future. This pressure intensified during long dances or performances when leaving the room was nearly impossible. The expectation to remain composed, alert, and graceful created an internal tension that grew with each passing hour. Women learned to measure their movements carefully. They stood straighter, breathed shallowly, and held their muscles still to prevent revealing signs of discomfort. They trained themselves to endure physical strain because the alternative public acknowledgement of a private need felt far more threatening. The architecture of ballrooms also shaped this fear. Large doors opened directly into central gathering spaces, meaning anyone who exited was immediately visible. Corridors often lacked dividing walls or private corners. Light illuminated not only the center of the room but also the pathways leading out of it. There were few shadows to disappear into. This environment amplified the sense of exposure, turning each exit into a moment of risk. Women had to wait for music to swell or crowds to shift before attempting to leave without attracting attention. Even when accompanied by a friend or maid, the risk remained. Moving in pairs could draw curiosity, and any deviation from expected behavior invited speculation. A simple change in direction or timing was enough for observers to weave narratives about what a woman might be doing. The stories did not need to be true. They only needed to be interesting, and gossip in Victorian society spread quickly, feeding on small details that grew into larger assumptions. The pressure to maintain composure affected not only the decision to leave, but also the decision to stay. Many women endured physical discomfort far longer than was reasonable, choosing pain over the possibility of judgment. They stood stiffly through dances, held conversations without revealing strain, and avoided drinks even when thirsty. These choices shaped the entire evening, turning what appeared to be light-hearted entertainment into a controlled performance. The emotional weight of this vigilance accumulated gradually. It settled in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses between dances, and in the quiet corners, where women slowed their breathing while pretending to admire decorations or fans. The effort to remain calm took as much energy as the dancing itself. By the end of the night, many women returned home exhausted, not from the festivities, but from the constant pressure to remain unreadable. This pattern revealed how deeply society valued the appearance of restraint. A woman's ability to suppress discomfort was treated as a reflection of her character. This expectation did not distinguish between minor and major strain. It applied equally to every form of physical need. As a result, women internalized the belief that silence was the only acceptable response to personal discomfort, and that revealing even a hint of need could unravel the carefully constructed image they were expected to maintain. Beneath the surface of celebration, the ballroom became a stage where judgment moved quietly among the guests. Every exit, every expression, and every adjustment carried meaning. Women navigated this environment with precision born of necessity, knowing that even a harmless action could turn into a private burden or a public embarrassment. This constant vigilance exposed how little room women had to show their own needs. The fear of scrutiny shaped their bodies and choices long before discomfort reached its peak. A deeper tension waited inside these crowded rooms, growing heavier as endurance pushed against the limits demanded by etiquette. Preparation for a Victorian ball began long before the music started, and for many women, the earliest steps centered on managing their bodies in ways that would remain invisible throughout the night. The pressure to avoid leaving the ballroom unnecessarily meant that they had to anticipate discomfort hours in advance, shaping their routines around a need that society demanded they never acknowledge. These strategies were quiet, deliberate, and widely understood, even if no one discussed them openly. One of the most common methods was simply reducing water intake during the afternoon. Women learned to limit drinking as the day progressed, knowing that any excess fluid would eventually create problems under the restrictive conditions of the evening. This choice came with its own consequences. Dehydration made them more susceptible to dizziness, especially once the heat of the ballroom and the strain of their clothing accumulated. Yet they accepted this risk because the alternative, needing to excuse themselves at the wrong moment, felt far more dangerous to their social standing. Many women also made a point of using the toilet immediately before getting dressed. This step was non-negotiable, especially given the difficulty of managing their gowns once fully laced and layered. The act itself was practical, but it carried a sense of finality. Once they stepped into their corsets and skirts, they knew that relief would be difficult to access for hours. The tight lacing compressed the abdomen, reducing the ability to sense fullness accurately, while also increasing the pressure on the bladder. Even so, women treated this pre-dressing ritual as a necessary precaution, one of the last private moments before surrendering their physical comfort to the demands of the evening. Beyond these basic measures, some women adopted more extreme forms of control. This often involved wearing additional bands or lightly binding the lower abdomen to create artificial resistance. The pressure discouraged the body from responding normally to early signals of urgency. Though uncomfortable, this method allowed them to endure longer without showing signs of distress. It was a technique passed quietly between women who understood how unforgiving the social environment could be. There was no illusion that these methods were healthy. They were simply effective in postponing what could not be allowed to surface. These practices reflected a broader pattern within Victorian life, where discipline over the body was equated with propriety. Women learned early that self-control was not just a virtue but a requirement. Restricting water, timing their bodily functions, and using techniques to suppress natural urges all fit into this larger system of expectation. The rituals they performed before a ball were not separate from daily life. They were extensions of routines built around modesty and restraint. The physical effect of these preparations followed women into the evening. Hunger increased more quickly when water intake was low. Fatigue settled into their limbs sooner, especially when combined with the heat of the rooms and the weight of their gowns. Lightheadedness appeared at unexpected moments, sometimes during a dance, sometimes while standing still in crowded spaces. Yet these sensations were not considered valid reasons to break decorum. They had to absorb them quietly, maintaining the appearance of control, even when their bodies protested. Some women experimented with adjusting their diets earlier in the day. Eating lighter meals reduced internal pressure and improved comfort once the corset was tightened. Avoiding certain foods helped minimize bloating or digestive discomfort, both of which could complicate an already demanding night. These decisions were subtle and careful, shaped by experience, and taught through observation rather than instruction. They added another layer of planning to an event that already required complex preparation. Each woman developed her own version of these strategies, refining them over time. Experience taught them how far they could push themselves before the discomfort became overwhelming. Some learned to remain still for long periods without revealing strain. Others mastered the ability to move gracefully, even when their bodies felt tense. Through trial and error, they discovered how to balance the demands of the evening with the realities of their physical limitations. The psychological weight of these preparations often lasted longer than the discomfort itself. The knowledge that failure could lead to embarrassment, gossip, or damage to one's reputation created a sense of vigilance that persisted throughout the night. Women did not simply prepare their bodies. They prepared their minds, entering the ballroom with an awareness of what was expected of them and what would happen if they faltered. These quiet routines created a rhythm that began long before the first dance. They revealed how much of the evening was shaped by private effort rather than public performance. To an outsider, a woman entering a ballroom looked graceful, composed, and ready for the festivities. But beneath this outward calm lay hours of management calculation and suppression efforts that remained unseen because they were meant to be unseen. Even the smallest choices, such as taking a sip of tea or adjusting posture, connected back to the earlier preparations. Women felt the consequences of their decisions, with every step reminded constantly of the balance they had tried to create. Some managed the night without incident. Others reached a level of discomfort that tested their endurance. But all of them knew that success depended not just on how they carried themselves in the ballroom, but on the quiet discipline they had practiced beforehand. These careful preparations revealed how far women had to go simply to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Each decision carried the weight of expectations that shaped their bodies before the night even began. A deeper strain waited once these preparations met the unpredictable demands of social judgment. Women who were pregnant or older entered a Victorian ballroom with a different kind of burden, one that pressed closer to the body and tightened more quickly than anything shaped by fabric or etiquette. Their physical limits met the strict expectations of society at every turn, and the quiet endurance required of them intensified under these conditions. What younger women could hide through posture and controlled breathing became far more difficult for those whose bodies carried changes that could not be managed by discipline alone. Pregnant women faced a unique challenge from the moment they stepped into their gowns. The pressure caused by tight corsets was already difficult for most guests, but for them, the compression affected balance, breath, and circulation in ways that demanded constant awareness. Each movement required careful calculation to avoid discomfort that would grow sharper with time. Even small shifts in posture could create tension that radiated through the abdomen and lower back, yet they were expected to maintain the same level of composure as everyone else in the room. The need to hold themselves became significantly more difficult as the evening progressed. Bodily pressure built more quickly, and the weight placed on their bladder responded to even minor exertion. Dancing was often out of the question, not simply because it strained the body, but because the risk of revealing discomfort was too great. Sitting offered only partial relief. The layers of fabric and the tightness of the corset forced them into rigid positions that did little to ease the physical demand. Still, they sat with controlled calmness, as though the stillness itself were effortless. Older women carried a different strain. Age made joints stiffen, muscles tire more quickly, and internal pressure rises without warning. What they had once suppressed through practice now required far more energy. Years of experience taught them how to read a room, how to present themselves with dignity, and how to move without attracting attention. But their bodies no longer cooperated as reliably. A long evening could turn into a slow negotiation between physical limitations and the unyielding expectations of decorum. Despite these difficulties, the rules remained the same for everyone. Pregnant or not, older or not, a woman was expected to hide her needs completely. This expectation did not soften when bodies became less predictable or more fragile. The standards of elegance and restraint are applied equally regardless of circumstance. Social judgment did not distinguish between age or condition. It focused only on visible signs of strain. As a result, these women often positioned themselves near exits or close to the edges of crowded rooms. This was not done openly or with acknowledgement. They moved into these spaces quietly, selecting chairs that allowed a slightly shorter path to privacy should the need arise. Even these choices carried anxiety, because selecting a seat too close to a side door could raise questions. They had to appear as though the placement was incidental, not deliberate. Many chose not to dance at all. The physical effort, combined with the fear of revealing a private need, made the experience too risky. Instead, they observed from the sidelines, participating through presence rather than movement. Their smiles and measured nods masked the tension building beneath their clothing, a tension that tightened with each passing hour. They maintained a composure that grew heavier the longer they remained seated. A few women relied quietly on trusted companions, friends, sisters, or discreet maids who understood their situation. These companions watched the room for attention shifts, ready to guide them toward privacy when opportunity allowed. But even with support, the pressure remained. The fear of being seen leaving the room, the worry of attracting gossip, and the knowledge that their physical needs might betray them created a sense of constant vigilance. For pregnant women, the strain could escalate suddenly. A single movement, a rise in temperature, or a moment of pressure from the corset could make the need for relief immediate. Yet the journey to privacy was rarely straightforward. The hallways were long, the crowds dense, and the expectation of grace unwavering. They walked slowly, keeping their posture steady, even as urgency built with each step. No part of the process allowed for haste. Older women experienced similar moments. Their endurance had limits that social rules refused to acknowledge. aching joints made standing painful, yet remaining seated for too long increased pressure on the bladder. Fatigue dulled their reactions, and they measured their movements with caution to avoid revealing the discomfort that grew steadily through the night. Despite all of this, they remained present because attendance was not optional. Social events were obligations, part of the structure that defined their place in society. Absence suggested weakness, unreliability, or withdrawal. The pressure to attend, combined with the pressure to endure, created a dual burden that shaped their entire evening. The ballroom offered no softness for those who needed it. Music filled the air, light reflected from crystal fixtures, and guests moved with polished precision. But within that elegance, pregnant and older women carried a quiet battle that no one acknowledged. Their restraint was deeper, their silence heavier, and their endurance more fragile than anyone allowed themselves to admit. These women revealed how much strength was hidden beneath expected composure. Their bodies carried pressures that etiquette refused to soften, tightening their limits far earlier than those around them. Rising vulnerability gathered beneath this endurance, pressing harder as the night demanded even more control. Beneath the polished world of Victorian grandeur, there was a quieter, heavier truth that most people never acknowledged. A truth wrapped tightly under layers of silk, lace, and rigid social expectations. During those long nights of dancing, when chandeliers glowed like suspended stars and orchestras carried the crowd from one waltz to the next, every woman in the room carried an invisible burden no one dared mention. The elegance was real, the beauty undeniable, but the human reality behind it was constantly suppressed, tucked away like something shameful. Bodies were expected to behave like perfect ornaments, silent, controlled, and endlessly patient. Victorian society rested heavily on surface impressions. A flawless appearance meant everything, and any disruption, even a natural, unavoidable one, could risk judgment. Women learned early that their bodies belonged not only to themselves but also to the eyes that watched them. They had to move gracefully, stand straight, and stay composed no matter what their physical needs were. To falter even slightly could draw whispers. To excuse oneself too often could spark rumors. The pressure to maintain poise shaped their behavior, their posture, and even their breath. Inside those vast ballrooms, the warmth from candles and crowded bodies created an oppressive atmosphere. Dresses layered with fabric and steel made each step a negotiation. Corsets tightened the waist, and ribs restricting both movement and the ability to react naturally to discomfort. All the while, every woman had to smile, glide, and radiate ease. Meanwhile, beneath the glamour, their bodies reminded them quietly but insistently of limits that no etiquette book could erase. There were moments when a pause in music brought a brief chance to breathe, but rarely enough to address what their bodies had been holding back the entire evening. The silence around these needs created an unspoken rule. Natural functions were treated as failings. Speaking of them would have shattered the illusion of perfect femininity that Victorian culture demanded. Generations of women experienced the same discomfort, yet each endured it alone, believing it was her responsibility to hide it flawlessly. This collective silence formed its own kind of discipline. Privacy became a privilege they did not truly possess. They managed discomfort with small, precise gestures, adjusting weight from one leg to the other, taking smaller sips of tea, and controlling their breathing. Everything had to blend seamlessly with the choreography of social life. The social stakes amplified the pressure. Reputations could rise or fall on the smallest detail. A misstep in dance might be forgiven, but a hint of physical urgency could become a season-long scandal. A woman's public image was fragile, built on layers of expectation. She had to be beautiful, graceful, resilient, and above all silent about anything that disrupted the illusion. There is something almost absurd about how a society obsessed with refinement could be so ruthless about such ordinary human needs. Yet that was the world of the Victorian ballroom, brilliant on the outside, rigid at its core. Modern conveniences make these struggles seem like distant exaggerations. Even the most crowded modern restroom would feel like a sanctuary compared to what these women navigated. The difference highlights how deeply Victorian expectations ignored the natural rhythms of the human body. Their world valued display more than comfort, ritual more than honesty. Women were expected to absorb the discomfort, quietly transforming survival into an elegant performance. Every hour that passed intensified the strain. The gowns that once felt magnificent at the beginning of the night became heavier. The corset's embrace became sharper. Muscles tightened. Sweat gathered beneath layers of fabric that allowed no air to escape. But through it all, a Victorian woman learned to keep her expression composed. Her body might ache, but her face remained calm, her posture flawless. This was the uncelebrated endurance, hidden behind the grand image of the era. The truth became visible only in small, fleeting details. A woman lingering near a doorway, a brief tightening around the eyes, a breath held just a moment too long. These glimpses revealed a story that no historian's painting or romantic novel captured. In those dim corners of the ballroom, humanity quietly resurfaced. A body asking for relief, a mind calculating time, a heart hoping no one would notice. These tiny moments were universal, yet they rarely found their way into accounts of Victorian life. The walk back home after a long night offered the first genuine release. As carriages rolled through quiet streets and lanterns flickered against windows, women finally exhaled the discomfort they had carried for hours. Home meant privacy, and privacy meant the freedom to let the body speak again. Their dresses loosened, their breath deepened, and their rigid control softened. In these moments, the contrast between the ballroom's strict demands and the natural world's quiet acceptance became painfully clear. The stories left out of Victorian history, the discomfort, the endurance, the unspoken suffering, reveal a different portrait of the era. Beneath every elegant figure in a painting stands a real woman who learned to endure silence for the sake of appearances. The era's beauty is undeniable, but its demands cut deeply into the lives of those forced to uphold them. That hidden cost is the part of the story we rarely hear. Elegance demanded silence, even when silence hid the most basic truths. Layers of lace and silk covered realities no one dared speak aloud. Every glittering ballroom carried shadows where the human body quietly begged to be acknowledged. During those long Victorian nights, when music drifted endlessly through the ballroom and candles flickered against their glass covers, the matter of bodily relief became something far more calculated than instinctive. For many women, the ability to manage the simplest biological need turned into a quiet strategy, one woven beneath layers of etiquette and strict expectations. The shimmering gowns, the delicate gloves, the rigid corsets, all demanded a body that behaved perfectly, or at least appeared to. And because the social pressure was relentless, even the act of finding a place to relieve oneself felt like stepping into forbidden territory. The first task was information. Knowing the layout of a grand house was essential. Women learned the locations of retiring rooms, small corridors, guest chambers, and any space where privacy might exist for a few moments. These mental maps were rarely spoken aloud, yet every woman held one built from observation during past gatherings, or whispered instructions from a maid. Movement had to be discreet, so paths were chosen with precision, avoiding the brightest clusters of guests or the areas where men gathered to talk. The architecture of the night became a quiet puzzle, one solved with patience and subtle calculation. Timing mattered just as much as location. The sequence of dances, the breaks between sets and the intervals before supper, all influenced when a woman could attempt to leave the floor without attracting attention. Some waited for the moment the music shifted, allowing the natural flow of bodies to cover their exit. Others relied on short pauses when partners changed. No single moment was perfect, but some were safer than others, especially if the host's home lacked an abundance of private spaces. The night's rhythm controlled everything, even the most private decisions. The presence of maids made the strategy possible. They moved around the perimeter of the ballroom, unseen by most yet vital to its functioning. They guided their mistresses through crowded hallways, held layers of fabric, and ensured that the complicated structures beneath the dresses remained intact during the delicate process. These young women understood the stakes, perhaps more clearly than anyone else. A small mishap could ruin not only the mistress's evening, but also the maid's reputation as a competent attendant. Their quiet coordination formed an invisible partnership built on necessity. Some women arranged small signals with their maids, subtle adjustments of a glove, a shift in posture, a nod toward a specific door. These gestures were simple, almost invisible, yet carried the weight of urgent communication. The maid responded quickly, even anticipating what was required before a word could be spoken. Together, they moved with practiced precision, shielding both the dress and the dignity of the woman they served. In a world where appearances held more power than comfort, such teamwork became an unspoken survival skill. The reality of the situation rarely matched the elegance of the surroundings. The rooms designated for privacy were often cramped, warm, and poorly lit. A slop jar or porcelain pot might sit in the corner, its presence disguised by screens or cloth. A maid would lift the heavy skirt, shift the steel frame, and help position her mistress in a way that avoided disaster. The process was awkward, silent, and demanding, yet it occurred countless times during a single season of dancing. Victorian women lived under an expectation of perfection, but perfection required constant, meticulous assistance. Not all houses offered the luxury of privacy. Some had only one retiring room, forcing women to wait in long, uncomfortable lines, hidden behind decorative screens. The pressure of time added tension. Staying away too long risked gossip. Leaving too soon risked discomfort. These calculations formed a strange rhythm that paralleled the music from the ballroom, a separate performance taking place behind closed doors. Women who seemed graceful and effortless on the dance floor were often engaged in a quiet battle against the limitations of their own attire. Throughout the evening, restraint remained a guiding rule. Women monitored their consumption of drinks, controlling how much tea or champagne they allowed themselves. The warmth of the room encouraged thirst, yet every sip carried consequences. They balanced hydration against risk-enduring dryness in their throats, rather than face the embarrassment of too many trips away from the crowd. Nothing about the experience was simple, and every decision required careful judgment, shaped by the rigid codes of Victorian society. As the night progressed, the strain accumulated. Muscles tightened beneath corsets. Layers of fabric grew heavier with the heat. The pressure became constant, building slowly as the hours stretched onward. Yet the dancers glided, smiled, and moved through the waltz as though nothing troubled them. Maintaining this illusion was part of the expected refinement, a skill learned through years of repetition. There is something quietly unsettling about how much effort was required just to appear unbothered. It reflects a world where the body was expected to obey forms stronger than its own nature. Even the most confident women carried within them a tension that modern eyes would easily recognize as exhaustion. Behind the elegance lay a simple truth. Managing bodily needs was not merely a matter of hygiene, but a matter of social survival. Navigating these constraints demanded awareness, cooperation, and a type of courage no one wrote about in the guidebooks of the time. The beauty of the ballroom came at a cost, and the cost was borne silently by those expected to uphold the illusion. Beneath the shining lights, these strategies exposed how much effort it took just to maintain dignity. Their careful movements revealed a hidden choreography shaped by necessity rather than grace. A deeper tension waited beneath the surface, hinting at what the night would demand once expectations grew even heavier. There is a quiet weight that settles when the music of a Victorian night finally fades. The hall grows still, the chandeliers dim, and the last echo of laughter slips into silence. What remains is the truth that lingered beneath every shimmering gown, every choreographed gesture, every tightly laced corset that held more than just fabric in place. The swollen silhouettes of the dresses were symbols of status, luxury, and discipline. But they were also burdens, structures that confined the body while shaping the image expected from women in those long ceremonial hours. You witnessed how personal comfort was crushed beneath demands for composure. Within the layers of tulle and steel, within the lacquered elegance of lace and silk, there existed a body required to behave as though it were not a body at all. A woman moved as a display, not as a human being with natural needs. Her posture, her breath, her timing, even the simple urge to relieve herself had to be managed with precision. What the world called beauty she understood as pressure. What the world admired as grace she carried as labor. The issue of personal hygiene, so basic, so essential, became something muffled and nearly unspeakable. Etiquette rewrote instinct. Silence muted need. Each movement had to be calculated, so that nothing slipped through the polished facade. Even small discomforts were swallowed. Even urgency was hidden. A woman endured because the rules left her no choice. The society around her measured her success by how well she concealed the parts of herself that made her human. Yet the question remained, hovering at the corner of every Victorian ballroom. How did they manage? How did they perform? Hours of dancing while trapped inside towering skirts. How did they survive the weight, the heat, the pressure, the lack of an hour? Modern plumbing. The scrutiny of those who looked but did not to truly see. How did they balance the expectations placed upon them with the demands of their own bodies? Those questions were whispered only in private, if they were spoken at all. To search for the answer is to open a small door into a hidden realm of history. Behind the glittering surfaces lay truths wrapped in discomfort. Women were forced to navigate their bodily needs through improvised tools, discreet assistance, dim rooms, and a fragile choreography of timing and restraint. Their struggles rarely appeared in diaries or letters. Respectability erased traces of inconvenience. Silence protected reputations, but it also buried experience. Beneath the lace, beneath the fragrance, beneath the shimmering fabric, there existed a constant negotiation between desire and duty. Even the most elaborate dresses concealed something fragile and unspoken. The burden of maintaining dignity in a world where dignity required denial. This denial shaped everything. It shaped how long a woman stayed near the dance floor. It shaped how much she drank. It shaped how tightly she breathed. It shaped how she considered every hallway, every staircase, every softly lit corner where she might find a slop jar or a retiring room. It shaped her relationship with her maid, who became not simply a helper, but a guardian of her privacy. Those maids witnessed what others did not, the trembling effort of balancing cloth and steel, the awkward angles required to avoid disaster, the fear inside the silence. They moved like shadows, quietly supporting the performance that society demanded from the women above them. A dropped pin, a mislifted skirt, a wrong step in the dark could destroy a reputation. The boundary between grace and humiliation narrowed to a thread, and within that narrowness lived a truth no one dared acknowledge. Elegance required suffering. The world saw flawless silhouettes drifting beneath chandeliers. It did not see the tension, the discomfort, the vigilance. It did not see the way a woman's body asked for relief, while etiquette insisted on stillness. It did not see the quiet panic buried beneath layers of brocade. It did not see the exhaustion hidden beneath powdered cheeks. It did not hear the thoughts she carried as she counted each minute, waiting for a break in the music that would allow her a discreet exit. But you saw hints of it. The slight stiffness in posture, the hurried glances exchanged with a maid, the careful choice of a chair near a door, the faint tremor in a hand that held too long to a fan too long. These were signs left behind like fingerprints on silk traces of lives performed under pressure. History often forgets the small truths because they do not fit grand narratives. Yet these small truths reveal more than the grand ones do. They show how human beings adapted, endured, and concealed. They show how beauty was constructed on top of discomfort. They show how the simplest bodily needs shaped the secret corners of a glittering world. The question that seems small, how did Victorian women use the toilet during all-night dancing, is not small at all. It is a doorway to understanding how society controlled the female body, how silence was imposed, and how expectations restricted movement and choice. It exposes the gap between appearance and reality, between what society praised and what women privately endured. It uncovers the parts of life that history tends to push into the shadows, not because they lack importance, but because they reveal too much. By peering into this tucked-away detail, you uncover a larger truth beneath the grandeur, beneath the order, beneath the rituals. History is filled with hidden struggles that shaped ordinary lives. Lives that looked perfect from afar, carried burdens no one asked about. The lace was beautiful, yes, but the silence beneath it was heavy. And in that silence lived the parts of history most worth understanding. Tonight, may your rest settle softly as these hidden stories fade into the quiet, leaving only the gentle weight of what you now know.